3 rings for the Elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie, 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them, in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. Hello and welcome to The Broken Sword. Today we are discussing the One Ring and we'll look at its powers and the purpose behind all of the Rings of Power.
Build me a army worthy of Mordor.
I hope you are all doing very well today. I would love it if you please considered subscribing to the channel to stay up to date with all our Tolkien and Middle-earth content. In this video we're looking at the making of the One Ring and the other Rings of Power, their powers and purpose, and trying to understand what Sauron intended and really what went wrong. Before the First Age, Sauron, who also went by names like that of Gorthau the Cruel, was one of the most powerful of his order, the Maiar. He excelled as a student of Aule, the valor of craftsmanship and material shaping. Being the valor of craftsmanship and material, he would seek to bring order through craftsmanship, and this is why, when the time was right, Sauron would attempt to impose his will on the world, and this is why, when the time came, Sauron attempted to impose his own will on Arda by using craft to forge the Rings of Power. But when he went by Mairon, his initial Maya name, he had no such open aspiration. Along came Malkor, however, the most powerful of his order himself, the Valar. Mairon saw in him perhaps an opportunity to perfect creation by bringing absolute order to Arda, and to do that he would need to impose his will on material creatures. At the time, however, all this was just a thought in his mind. Malkor turned into Morgoth, Mairon into Sauron. During the First Age, Sauron was content to serve his new master to the best of his ability, until his defeat. Sauron was able to spy on the Valar on behalf of Morgoth before he ever revealed himself as a servant and act in his capacity as Morgoth's chief lieutenant in the War of Wrath. Over the ages, Sauron has worn many guises and played many roles. In the First Age he was an immortal spirit named Mairon. As an active lieutenant of Morgoth, Sauron would participate in the Wars of Beleriand. His own story would only come to center stage after Morgoth had his feet hewn from under him and he was hurled upon his face. The Silmarils were then removed from his crown and he was cast through the door of night into the void. With the first Dark Lord gone, Sauron was able to exercise his powers to achieve his own purpose, to do as he would as his own master and not as a servant to a greater evil. After Morgoth was defeated and expelled from Middle-earth, Sauron feigned repentance, though he never faced the Valar. He began work on the fortress of Barad-dûr in the lands of Mordor in the year 1000 of the Second Age. He called himself then Annatar, Lord of Gifts, and in this fair guise that he now took, he introduced himself to the elves of Middle-earth, and offered his wisdom and his lore, claiming to be an emissary of the Valar. He was barred entry into Lindon as Gil-galad and Elrond sensed something amiss, but were not certain to his intentions. Turned away at Lindon, he travelled to the elven lands of Eregion, ruled by Celebrimbor. As one of the Maiar, an immortal being who existed before the making of the world, there was much to learn from Sauron, and the elves would benefit from this friendship in the beginning. But elsewhere, the elves received him gladly, and few among them hearkened to the messengers from Lindon bidding them beware. For Sauron took to himself the name of Annatar, the Lord of Gifts, and they had at first much profit from his friendship. And he said to them, Alas, for the weakness of the great, for the mighty king is Gil-galad, and wise in all lore is Master Elrond, and yet they will not aid me in my labours. Can it be that they do not desire to see other lands become as blissful as their own? But wherefore should Middle-earth remain forever desolate and dark, whereas the elves could make it as fair as Eresia, nay, even as Valinor? And since they have not returned thither, as you might, I perceive that you love this Middle-earth, as do I. Is it not then our task to labour together for its enrichment, and for the raising of all elven kindreds that wander here untaught to the height of that power and knowledge which those have who are beyond the sea? Sauron convinced Celebrimbor of his honour and good-natured intentions, and through him they learned the art of forging rings of power. They made a number of lesser rings, and when their power and their lore were increased, they forged the great rings of power with Sauron. 7 for the dwarves, and 9 for mortal kings. But they would make 3 rings of their own, for the elves to focus their own powers and to protect their own realms. The forging of the One Ring and completion of Barad-dûr would then take place around the year 1600 of the Second Age, and Sauron would reveal himself unintentionally. But how was Sauron able to convince someone as wise and as honourable as Celebrimbor to participate? Tolkien gives us an answer in a long letter to a Milton Waldman, which had the original purpose of explaining the connection of the Silmarillion to The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. However, we do get on to this point. But many of the elves listened to Sauron. He was still fair in that early time, and his motives and those of the elves seemed to go partly together. The healing of the desolate lands. Sauron found their weak point in suggesting that, helping one another, they could make Western Middle-earth as beautiful as Valinor. It was really a veiled attack on the gods, an incitement to try and make a separate independent paradise. Gil-galad repulsed all such overtures, as also did Elrond. But at Eregion, great work began, and the elves came to their nearest to falling to magic and machinery. With the aid of Sauron's lore, they made rings of power. This brings us to another question, that being what could such rings offer the elves? They were immortal and wise, learned in the arts and laws, and held counsel with the greatest powers in the world. In that same letter, Tolkien further explains the power of the ring and of all rings in his legendarium. The chief power of all the rings alike was the prevention or showing of decay, i.e. change viewed as a regrettable thing, the preservation of what is desired or loved, or its semblance. This is more or less an elvish motive. But also they enhanced the natural powers of the possessor, thus approaching magic, a motive easily corruptible into evil, a lust for domination. And finally, they had other powers more directly derived from Sauron. The Necromancer, so he is called as he casts a fleeting shadow and presage on the pages of The Hobbit, such as rendering invisible the material body and making things of the invisible world visible. The elves had no intention of using the rings as a way to dominate others, only to preserve their lands and peoples. They had no intention to harm or enslave the peoples of Middle-earth, which is what we are told from the same letter when Tolkien describes the rings made without the influence of Sauron. The elves of Eregion made 3 supremely beautiful and powerful rings, almost solely of their own imagination and directed to the preservation of beauty. They did not confer invisibility. But secretly, in the subterranean fire, in his own black land, Sauron made One Ring, the ruling ring that contained the powers of all the others, and controlled them, so that its wearer could see the thoughts of all those that used the lesser rings, could govern all that they did, and in the end could utterly enslave them. He reckoned, however, without the wisdom and subtle perceptions of the elves. The moment he assumed the One, they were aware of it, and of his secret purpose, and were afraid. They hid the 3 rings, so that not even Sauron ever discovered where they were, and they remained unsullied. The others they tried to destroy. Sauron's intention was to forge the rings and pass them to the highest-ranking lords of each race to inhabit Middle-earth. His endgame was that, when they put on the rings, he would be able to see their thoughts and control them as thralls. the way he would corrupt and deform the human kings, turning them into the ringwraiths, the Nazgul, servants of his will. This was his goal with every ring, that of domination and control. His plan was a partial success. Its powers were unique and numerous. It sharpened one's sight in the dark and amplified one's hearing so much so that when Samwise Gamgee put on the ring, his hearing was so refined he was unable to properly estimate the distance. It would grant a reprieve to those who held a fear of dying, as we see in how long it would prolong Bilbo's life, reveal the invisible world, and for Sauron himself, it would enhance his powers and confer on him his heart's desire, the domination of all the world and its peoples. In the end, Sauron was much like his master, Malkor, inhumanely patient and far-sighted. Sauron plays the long game and has uncanny patience, cunning, and the powers of the Maiar, a being of immortal heritage and wrapped in the appearances of his own design, some fair, others repulsive. As Malkor was once a fair and beautiful Valar, brought forth in the song of Eru Ilúvatar, he would bring discord in the second theme, and so Eru brought forth the third theme, as nothing of Malkor's design could do anything but elevate and beautify the greater theme of God. Sauron was the discord of the second and third ages, and bound his will to that of an object, a machine that would serve his envy and enforce his wrath. The singularity of Sauron's ring is the author's way of distinguishing it from others, like his famous Silmarils, as the Elven rings did much good in their worlds and established the wearers in their domain, such as Galadriel in Lothlorien and Elrond at Rivendell. But their rings of power were pure, without the tinge of evil, and was such a beautiful and honourable creation of the great Celebrimbor, whom we must hold innocent in his participation with Sauron, as he was not the first or the last good character to be deceived and corrupted by the whispers and cunning of a rogue angel like that of Sauron. To understand why Sauron created the One Ring, we need to start with his origins. Sauron was originally a Maiar, a powerful spirit created by Eru Ilúvatar before the shaping of the world. Initially, he served Aule the Smith, one of the Valar, and was known as Mairon. Sauron was skilled in craftsmanship and had a deep appreciation for order and structure. However, Sauron's thirst for power and control led him to align with Malkor, later known as Morgoth, the first Dark Lord. Under Morgoth's tutelage, Sauron's ambitions grew darker. He became Morgoth's most trusted lieutenant, learning the ways of domination and deceit. After Morgoth's defeat in the War of Wrath at the end of the First Age, Sauron went into hiding. Despite his master's downfall, Sauron retained his desire for power and control over Middle-earth. He was determined to succeed where Morgoth had failed, and so he began to lay the groundwork for his own rise to power. Sauron's primary motivation for creating the One Ring was his insatiable desire for control. He sought to dominate Middle-earth and bend all its inhabitants to his own will. By pouring a significant portion of his power into the One Ring, Sauron created a tool that could amplify his abilities and extend his influence far beyond his physical presence. The One Ring was designed to control the other rings of power, which had been distributed amongst the elves, the dwarves, and men. By controlling these rings, Sauron aimed to control the leaders of these races, thereby exerting his dominance over all of Middle-earth. Sauron's creation of the One Ring was an act of cunning and deceit. He had presented himself to the elves of Eregion as Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, and offered his knowledge to help them create the Rings of Power. Celebrimbor and the elven smiths known as the Gwaith Myrdain, eager to craft powerful artifacts, accepted his guidance without knowing his true identity. While the elves created their rings, Sauron secretly forged the One Ring in the fires of Mount Doom, and by doing so, he embedded within it the power to control the other rings, effectively turning the bearers of these rings into his thralls. This act of deception was a masterstroke in Sauron's plan to dominate Middle-earth. The One Ring was not just a tool of domination, it was also a reservoir of Sauron's power. By imbuing the ring with a significant portion of his essence, Sauron ensured that the ring would enhance his abilities and grant him near immortality as long as it remained intact. This investment of power made the ring an extension of Sauron himself, binding his fate to his existence. This also meant that the ring was inherently tied to Sauron's survival. If the ring were to be destroyed, it would significantly weaken Sauron and strip him of his ability to maintain a physical form, reducing him to a mere shadow of his former self. The One Ring was also a tool of psychological manipulation. It could corrupt the heart and minds of those who possessed it, exploiting their desires and ambitions. This corruption made it easier for Sauron to control individuals indirectly, sowing discord and mistrust among the free peoples of Middle-earth. The ring's ability to corrupt was a testament to Sauron's deep understanding of the darker aspects of the psyche, making his dominion not just a physical one, but a mental and emotional one as well. Sauron's ambitions extended beyond merely succeeding Morgoth. He aimed to establish himself as the supreme ruler of Middle-earth, a Dark Lord who could impose his will upon all living beings. His vision was one of totalitarian control, where every aspect of life was subject to his dominion. One of Sauron's most significant accomplishments in his quest for power was the downfall of Númenor. After being captured by Ar-Pharazôn, the last king of Númenor, Sauron used his cunning to corrupt the Númenóreans from within. He introduced them to the worship of Morgoth and incited their rebellion against the Valar. This rebellion led to the catastrophic downfall of Númenor, with the island being swallowed by the sea. Sauron's role in this event showcased his ability to manipulate and corrupt, further cementing his reputation as a master of deceit and domination. So with Númenor destroyed, Sauron turned his attention back to Middle-earth, seeking to establish his dominion over the surviving Dúnedain and other free peoples. The construction of Barad-dûr, his dark tower in Mordor, symbolised his growing power and ambition. Sauron's ultimate goal was to bring all of Middle-earth under his rule, creating an empire of darkness where his will was absolute. The One Ring was the key to achieving this vision, as it allowed him to attempt to control the leaders of men, elves and dwarves through the other rings of power. The One Ring had a profound impact on several key characters in Middle-earth. Gollum, once a hobbit-like creature named Smeagol, was utterly corrupted by the ring's influence, transforming into a twisted and pitiable being. Bilbo Baggins, who came into possession of the ring by chance, experienced its corrupting influence over time, becoming increasingly possessive and secretive. Frodo Baggins, the ring-bearer tasked with its destruction, struggled with the ring's power throughout his journey. The ring's influence on Frodo highlighted the internal struggle between good and evil, showcasing the ring's ability to exploit even the purest hearts. The existence of the One Ring and Sauron's relentless pursuit of it had a wide-ranging impact on Middle-earth. It spurred the formation of the Fellowship of the Ring, uniting members of different races in a common cause. The threat of Sauron's dominion galvanized the free peoples to resist, leading to key alliances and battles that shaped the course of history. The destruction of the ring also had far-reaching consequences. It marked the end of the Third Age and the beginning of the Fourth Age, a time when the dominion of men rose and the elves, dwarves, and other races began to fade into the background. The ring's destruction symbolized the triumph of good over evil and the hope for a new beginning. Sauron's plan to dominate Middle-earth was thwarted by the resilience and wisdom of the elves. When the elves sensed Sauron's true intentions upon his donning of the One Ring, they immediately removed their own rings and hid them, thus severing the link Sauron had hoped to establish. After all, the elven rings were the only ones Sauron never touched, so his ability to poison them never came out like the others. This act of defiance was a significant setback for Sauron, as it really prevented him from controlling the elves directly and led them to understand his true intentions. Despite this setback, Sauron continued his quest for domination. However, the formation of the last alliance of elves and men, led by Gil-galad and Elendil, posed a formidable challenge to his power. The alliance marched upon Mordor and besieged Barad-dûr, leading to a climactic battle that culminated in Sauron's physical defeat. Isildur, Elendil's son, managed to cut the One Ring from Sauron's hand, thereby stripping him of much of his power. However, Isildur's failure to destroy the ring meant that Sauron's spirit endured, allowing him to eventually rise again in the Third Age. Throughout the Third Age, the One Ring remained a symbol of Sauron's malice and his will to dominate. It was sought after by Sauron's minions and coveted by many, including Gollum and later Frodo Baggins. The ring's destruction in the fires of Mount Doom during the War of the Ring finally ended Sauron's threat, bringing his long-standing ambition to an ultimate and irrevocable end. So, there we have it. Sauron's decision to pour his cruelty, his malice, and his will to dominate all life into the One Ring was a strategic move born of his insatiable desire for control and power. By creating the ring, Sauron aimed to dominate Middle-earth through deception, corruption, and sheer force of will. His plan, however, was ultimately thwarted by the resilience of the Free Peoples and the fateful destruction of the One Ring. Understanding Sauron's motivations and the strategic brilliance behind the One Ring provides deeper insight into the enduring struggle between good and evil in Tolkien's world. Sauron's story is a testament to the corrupting influence of power and the pursuit of domination, themes that resonate throughout the histories of Middle-earth. So although it was never for good intentions, you can safely say that Sauron was a dark genius, and it truly shows how he became one of the most formidable villains ever to exist in Middle-earth. And so until next time, may the stars shine upon your path, and may you always resist the lure of the One Ring.
The Lord of the Rings is a story about courage and friendship, about how you should never underestimate anybody, because even the smallest and most unassuming people can do great things. At the centre of this great story is a ring. One Ring. This ring was created by Sauron as a way of controlling others, and after his initial defeat, the ring was wanted by many, and many others desired its destruction. But the ring itself has quite the story. In the year 1200 of the Second Age, the elves of Eregion began receiving great things from one calling themselves Annatar, Lord of Gifts. Annatar offered the elves his help and his vast knowledge to aid them in their power and influence in Middle-earth. However, even in this generous and kind form, Annatar was not trusted by all of the elves, particularly Gil-galad, Elrond and Galadriel. They were extremely suspicious of his deeper intentions. Although there were many jewelsmiths that were far more welcoming of Annatar, and their leader, Celebrimbor, accepted the gift of knowledge from this mysterious character. Annatar would remain in Eregion over the next few hundred years, helping the already very skilled smiths with their crafts that they loved. It wouldn't be long before the elven smiths, under the guidance and tuition of Annatar, forged the Rings of Power. 16 rings were made, and with their completion, Annatar left Eregion. However, the elves had a hidden agenda. They were to use the knowledge that they had gained from their teacher, from this bringer of such great gifts of knowledge, to create their own rings. 3 rings of power: Nenya, Narya, and Vilya. These 3 rings were far more powerful than the 16 that were previously created. Now, as I'm sure you already know by now, the elves had been deceived by this great deceiver. Annatar was, of course, Sauron. And Sauron had, in secret, forged a master ring that would rule over all of the others, using dark magic that he had taught them to use during the forging process of the others. But as we know, Sauron was unaware of the existence of the 3 elven rings, meaning he had no power over them. So in the year 1697 of the Second Age, Sauron waged war upon Eregion. He killed Celebrimbor and took the Rings of Power for himself, with the exception of the elven rings. With these powerful rings now in his possession, Sauron decided to use them as gifts. Gifts of deception, of course. He gifted 9 to great and powerful men in Middle-earth, telling them that the rings would grant them great power. However, just as the elves had been, the men were deceived, and soon began to bend to Sauron's will, fading more and more until they had no will of their own, and would eventually be 100% under the command of the Dark Lord, becoming ringwraiths. Spectral creatures that only wish to obey their new master. Sauron wanted to use the other 7 rings to do the same with the dwarves, gifting them to great and powerful dwarves, promising them fame and riches. But it did not work as planned, as the dwarves proved far more resistant to Sauron's magic than the men. As we know, in Middle-earth, men are easily corrupted. Then hundreds of years later, with Middle-earth falling further and further into darkness under Sauron's control, the combined armies of elves and men would form an alliance to march on Mordor and wage war on Sauron and his forces. The alliance was led by the great kings of each race, the men by Elendil of Numenor and the elves by Gil-galad of Eregion. The war lasted for years, and with the alliance finally being able to push the forces of Mordor back to the slopes of Mount Doom, Sauron himself had no choice but to enter the battle. He killed both of the great kings, but in doing so, he was also killed himself. Then the son of the king of Númenor, Isildur, took up the remains of his father's broken sword and cut the One Ring from Sauron's hand, finally defeating him and forcing the remaining dark forces to flee. Victorious in the war, Isildur had the chance to destroy the ring there and then, but like I just mentioned, the will of men is easily corrupted. So Isildur decided to keep the ring for himself, thinking it would bring him great power. But it was just 2 years later, while riding through the Gladden fields with his company, that Isildur was ambushed by an orc party. Here the ring betrayed Isildur, slipping from his finger and falling to the bottom of the river Anduin. Over the next 2,500 years, darkness began once again to spread over Middle-earth. The ring had waited at the bottom of the river until it was time for it to find a new bearer. It wasn't until 2463 of the Third Age that the ring was picked up by one of the river folk named Deagle, who happened to come across it while fishing. However, the influence of the ring quickly corrupted Deagle and his friend Smeagol, leading to Smeagol to kill his friend, taking the ring for himself, becoming 100% dominated by the ring. A few years later, Smeagol ventured into the Misty Mountains to have some alone time with his precious. Over the next 500 years, the ring completely consumed him. He forgot much of his own past, he forgot even his name, and became the creature known as Gollum. The ring would then stay with Gollum until it decided it was time to leave once again. So then it abandoned Gollum, trying to find a new way to return to its master. Then the next step in the ring's journey was unplanned. It was picked up by another of the most unlikely creatures, a hobbit, Bilbo Baggins of the Shire. Bilbo had gotten lost in the Goblin Caves during the quest of Erebor and came upon the ring, using its powers of invisibility to escape the caves. It just so happened that the hobbits actually have a very strong natural ability to resist the ring's power, and so he did not fall under the ring's influence. But then, on his 111st birthday, in the year 3001 of the Third Age, Bilbo decided to leave the Shire and journey to Rivendell once more. After some convincing from Gandalf, who could see the ring very slowly having an effect on Bilbo, he decided to leave the ring to Frodo. 17 years after Bilbo left the Shire, Gandalf returned, having discovered the truth of Bilbo's ring. The truth that it was in fact the One Ring, something that the Hobbit had never known, just thinking of it as a magical ring. Gandalf tasked Frodo then with taking the ring in secret to Rivendell, and after a perilous journey, Frodo and the ring made it to the Council of Elrond in Rivendell, and the council was made to decide the fate of the ring. Should it be kept safe? Should its power be used? Or should it be destroyed forever? After a great debate with many conflicting opinions, it was decided that the ring should be destroyed, and Frodo was once again chosen to bear the great burden that is the ring. It would be taken to Mordor, to the great fires of Mount Doom, the one place it could be destroyed. And so a fellowship was formed, and the quest to destroy Sauron forever began. I am sure you all know the story from here on out in great detail, so I won't end this video by just recapping the Lord of the Rings. But yes, Frodo eventually succeeds in the task of destroying the One Ring in Mount Doom, with a lot of help from Samwise Gamgee.
There are few objects in fiction as iconic and terrifying as the One Ring. It's not just a piece of jewelry, it's a tool of absolute corruption, a bridge between the physical and spiritual realms, and the embodiment of Sauron's will. But what exactly happens when someone puts it on? The movies give us a visual shorthand, blurry, grayscale distortions, ghostly figures, and that ever-present rushing sound. But Tolkien's own descriptions paint a much richer and more terrifying picture. Frodo dodged aside and again put the stone between them. There was only one thing he could do. Trembling, he pulled out the ring upon its chain and quickly slipped it on his finger, even as Boromir sprang at him again. The man gasped, stared for a moment amazed, and then ran wildly about, seeking here and there among the rocks and trees. At its core, the One Ring is more than just an artifact of power. It is a fragment of Sauron's essence, tied to his very will. It allows its wearer to shift partially into the unseen world, a realm where wraiths and dark spirits exist, making them invisible to the physical world but increasingly visible to Sauron and his servants. This effect is immediate for mortals. The moment someone like a Bilbo, Frodo, or Sam slips the ring onto their finger, they vanish from the eyes of the living but become exposed to forces beyond their comprehension. But what does this feel like? For this, we turn to one of the most detailed accounts in The Lord of the Rings, when Frodo puts on the ring at Amon Hen, shortly after Boromir tries to take it from him. This is one of the clearest descriptions of what it's actually like to wear the ring, told through Frodo's own experience. At first he could see little. He seemed to be in a world of mist in which there were only shadows. The ring was upon him. Then here and there the mist gave way and he saw many visions, small and clear, as if they were under his eyes upon a table, and yet remote. Right away, Tolkien gives us something beyond the typical invisibility trick we often associate with the ring. Frodo's perception shifts. He sees the world in layers, as if looking through time and space itself. Everywhere he looked, he saw the signs of war. The misty mountains were crawling like anthills. Orcs were issuing out of 1,000 holes. From the havens of Harrod's ships of war put out to sea, and out of the Eastmen who were moving endlessly. Swordsmen, spearmen, bowmen upon horses, chariots of chieftains and laden wains. All the power of the Dark Lord was in motion. The ring grants him a vision of the world from a near omniscient perspective, as if seeing the movements of armies from above. But this knowledge isn't empowering, it's horrifying. Then Frodo makes the mistake of looking towards Mordor. Then at last his gaze was held, wall upon wall, battlement upon battlement, black, immeasurably strong, mountain of iron, gate of steel, tower of adamant. He saw it. Barad-dûr, fortress of Sauron. All hope left him. And this is where the real danger begins. And suddenly he felt the eye. There was an eye in the dark tower that did not sleep. He knew that it had become aware of his gaze. A fierce, eager will was there. It leapt towards him, almost like a finger. He felt it, searching for him. Here's where we get one of the most terrifying aspects of the ring, wherein it doesn't just make you invisible, it invites Sauron's attention. This is no abstract evil. This is a direct, tangible consciousness. Sauron is there, and the moment Frodo puts on the ring, he knows. And worse, he calls. He heard himself crying out, "Never, never!" Or was it, "Verily I come to you?" He could not tell. That right there is the creeping horror of the One Ring. It doesn't just expose you to Sauron, it begins to change you. The wearer might think they are in control, that they are resisting, but their mind is already being pulled in two directions. We've seen this before. Gollum constantly refers to himself in two voices, as if two versions of himself are fighting for dominance. Isildur, after claiming the ring, refuses to destroy it, not because he suddenly loves evil, but because his thoughts have already begun shifting under its influence. Frodo in this moment is balanced between the eye's command and his own will. In a last moment of resistance, another voice manages to break through. Take it off, fool, take it off the ring. This outside force, possibly Gandalf, possibly the power of the 3 elven rings resisting, is what saves him. Frodo manages to tear the ring from his finger just before Sauron pins him down. The moment he does, the vision vanishes. He finds himself kneeling in sunlight, freed from the suffocating darkness of the ring's influence. So the biggest takeaway from this scene is that the One Ring isn't just a tool, it's a trap. It offers power, but only in ways that lead to subjugation. It grants vision, but makes the wearer vulnerable. It promises control, but undermines free will. This is why it could never be used against Sauron, no matter how noble the intent was. It's why Gandalf, Aragorn, Galadriel, none of them attempt to claim it. Even the strongest will in Middle-earth will bend under its influence if time is given. And for Frodo, despite all his strength, despite all his resistance, it is only at the last moment, when he's already standing at the crack of doom, that the ring finally wins. It does not empower its bearer, it owns them. And so, there we have it. When we see the ring in the Lord of the Rings movies, it's easy to think of it as a supernatural invisibility cloak, or as a tool that corrupts over time. But Tolkien's writings show us that the moment it is worn, it starts its work. It peels back the layers of reality, showing the world as Sauron sees it. It weakens the wearer's will, whispering commands even they don't recognize as foreign. And most importantly, it acts as a beacon, an open invitation for Sauron to reclaim what is his. So the next time you wonder what actually happens when someone puts on the One Ring, remember, it's not just about disappearing, it's about being seen. And that's a fate far worse. Why didn't Sauron turn invisible when wearing the One Ring? The easy answer to this is that Sauron, being a Maya, exists already in the Wraith world, or the Unseen world as it is also known. Therefore, he would not be affected by the ring in the same way we see other beings who wear the ring be affected. Another reason that might be more complicated would be that rather than sapping the strength of Sauron in the way it sapped the strength of Frodo or Bilbo by spreading him thin,
sort of stretched like butter scraped over too much bread.
The ring doesn't do this to Sauron. It contains much of what makes him such a terrible and cunning enemy inside of it.
And into this ring he poured his cruelty, his malice, and his will to dominate all life.
One ring to rule them all. One ring to find them. One ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them, in the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie. When Gandalf first lets Frodo in on the secret of why he has been so suspicious, coming and going for those long 17 years which separate the end of Bilbo's stay in the Shire and Frodo's departure for Buckland, we get a longer narrative that informs us of what Smeagol's character was like prior to his possession of the ring and his murder of his close relative, Deagol. What we learned about Smeagol was that prior to his taking of the ring, he was already crossing boundaries, digging into mounds, into the root of trees, and diving into deep pools. All of this behaviour is transgressive in Hobbit society, especially that of digging into mounds of roots and, in a sense, killing those trees. And it is possible this is Gandalf's way of telling Frodo that prior to Smeagol becoming Gollum, he was not as the hobbits of the Shire in Frodo's time were, nor even the relations of the Stores who lived by the Anduin in the time of Smeagol. Basically, he was a bit of an outsider anyway. He gradually came to hate the very face of the sun, shaking his fist at the light as he made his way into the Lonely Mountain. He used the powers of the ring to learn secrets, to spy on others, and potentially to blackmail his fellow Stores. The great matron of his clan drove him out of the community, and in a vivid image, as Gandalf puts it, Gollum bit at their feet while they kicked and punched at his stomach. The difference between Bilbo and Smeagol is not as great as Bilbo or Frodo would like to believe, and Gandalf is keen on pointing this out to Frodo. It is important to note, we are looking at the effects it had on someone who was already less than scrupulous. He intended to use the ring for his own purposes, not necessarily to undo the coming of the second shadow that was to cover the lands in a second darkness. When we learn this information from Gandalf, we've already been privy to the lengths to which he needed to go to convince Bilbo to go through with the entirety of his plan, to leave the ring behind, give it to Frodo and go and stay with the elves. It must be again said, for the sake of Bilbo's honour and integrity, of all known ring bearers to have claimed the ring for their own, he was and remains the only being to relinquish the ring of his own accord after having held it for an extended period of time, turning it over to Frodo, his heir. Yes, you had the likes of Gandalf touching it for a moment in Bag End, or Tom Bombadil flicking it around, but they are just moments, not days, weeks, or even months. The effect the ring has on a mortal being appears to be uniform, considering only their moral fortitude as buffers against the corruptive powers inherent in the ring itself. We know from Sam's experiences in the book that his hearing and senses are amplified when wearing the ring, to make the equivalent point for what it might do to an immortal Maya spirit, whose senses are already enhanced beyond the understanding of mortal men, hobbits, or monsters beneath the Misty Mountains. It is hard to overstate the extent to which Sauron's natural and unnatural powers are heightened and further realized by his wearing of the ring. He does not turn invisible because he exists in both worlds already, the seen and the unseen, as we have hints that few other characters do as well, characters such as the enigma that is Tom Bombadil, who also does not turn invisible when wearing the ring or playing with it, and a man who is brought up as a serious contender against the will of Sauron by Glorfindel at the Council of Elrond. And for those of you who don't know, he is rejected because he basically wouldn't care enough about it to follow everything through. He might just lose the ring, as how little he cares of it. But if anyone would like to see a dedicated video to the differences at the Council of Elrond in the book versus what happens in the Peter Jackson movies, then please leave us a comment of, right, where are we going? And we will get working on that for you all, because it is such a big chapter in the book and had to get cut down dramatically for the movies. We also know that the ring would have worked terrible sorcery through the deeds of Gandalf, which is why he kept himself at some distance from the ring as a whole. It is more likely that not that Gandalf would not turn invisible if he were to wear the ring, although there is some debate about this. We know that he remained visible while wearing the ring once given to him by Círdan, for example, being Narya, the Ring of Fire. Although obviously, the Elven rings are in no way close to the power of the One Ring and do not have the same powers within them either. So it's only really worth a quick mention. Of which, by the way, if you don't know, there were 3 Elven Rings of Power, with the other 2 being named Vilya, the Ring of Air, and Nenya, the Ring of Water, and we have videos discussing those rings if you would like to learn more about them. But if we now look at a moment from when Galadriel and Frodo are by the mirror of Galadriel in Lothlorien, she mentions in passing the effect that these rings had. They kept away the decay of time and allowed them to remain in Middle-earth long past the moment of their natural passing, making their usage of the rings closer in form and function to the rings worn by the 9 kings of men who were later transformed into the Nazgul. And she points out that with the destruction of the One Ring, their own rings of power would lose their effect on their lands. And so, this just emphasizes they cannot really be compared in the same way, as their effects and the effects of the One Ring are just not the same. But anyway, throughout The Lord of the Rings, we get the impression that anyone who wants to take the ring is usually not fitting to do so, and that after looking at Gandalf quickly, we can also now consider Saruman if he was ever able to take the ring. As the voice of Saruman says when the Nazgul approach him, were he in possession of that ring which they so seek, they would not need to ask him about it. Rather, they would be throwing themselves at his feet and naming him Lord. Again, no evidence to say that he would turn invisible or not, I guess, and as we kind of touched upon earlier, this really comes down to him being Maya, not a mortal being. And also again, for those of you who don't know, the Maiar are spirits that help the Valar, with the main ones we know being Sauron, Gandalf, Saruman, and Radagast amongst others. Now their thing is that they do not really have physical bodies, although they could take physical shapes while in Middle-earth. Therefore, the One Ring's ability to shift beings into the Wraith world from the physical world is a pointless thing. As we mentioned at the beginning, they exist in both. This really means that Sauron could turn himself invisible to the human eye anytime he wanted, and the One Ring did not have any impact on this. Only when another wore the One Ring could they then see him within this other world, with the main example we get from The Lord of the Rings being how Frodo saw Glorfindel at the Ford of Bruinen after being stabbed by the Witch King. As a being like Glorfindel, being one of the elves that had seen the light of the 2 trees, could exist in both at the same time, just like the Maiar. So although we have kept saying invisible, I guess technically that is not quite correct. Instead of turning invisible, it's almost more of a shift into a different dimension. But that doesn't change our answer. So there we have it at the end of all this, having a look at the effects of other rings, comparing them to the One Ring, as well as others of the Order of the Maiar, or even the Elves as well. It all comes down to that Sauron was able to exist in both the seen and unseen world simultaneously. When the Maiar came to Middle-earth, they would take on a physical form, as in their natural state, a physical form is not something they needed. There were rumours that Gandalf, before he was known as Gandalf, walked among the elves unseen, just to watch their ways. So there is no reason to think any other one of the Maiar could not do the same. Albeit, when the Istari are sent as the Istari, as the wizards, they are sent in weakened forms to help the fight against Sauron. So I'm really just talking about their true Maiar forms here. At the end of the day, Sauron was a pure spirit, purposely taking on each form that he did, and they are products of his own will. He was a master of both realms, and so the One Ring did not turn him invisible by simply putting it on.
Cast it into the fire! Destroy it!
Was this truly the only way to defeat Sauron and destroy the One Ring? In today's video, we take a common question that has been put to us by people from you legendary members of the Brohirrim, and we see what we can come up with by diving into the books and accompanying materials. So, we will look at the Council of Elrond, the state of Middle-earth during the Third Age, and we'll probably touch upon one or two other questions briefly to help us with our answer, such as, if the Valar still existed, why did they not come to dispute the dominion of Sauron, and why would they let such misery and suffering corrupt the world? Let's see what we can find out. Firstly, we need to address that kind of elephant in the room, the fact that this very question was addressed in the Council of Elrond, one of the more confusing chapters that my younger self had ever encountered during my first read-through. And I'm pretty certain, or at least hopeful, that I was not the only one with this opinion, but I feel like this is what makes the Council of Elrond such a great chapter. The more you learn about the world and its characters, the more you read the lore, the more those small bits of trivia and references kind of just pop up and you discover. It's just amazing. But as to the point of this particular video, why not take this One Ring across the sea to the Undying Lands? Well, this is what is said in the Council of Elrond chapter. Then if the ring cannot be kept from him ever by strength, said Glorfindel, two things only remain for us to attempt: to send it over the sea, or to destroy it. But Gandalf has revealed to us that we cannot destroy it by any craft that we here possess, said Elrond, and they who dwell beyond the sea would not receive it. For good or ill, it belongs to Middle-earth. It is for us who still dwell here to deal with it. This answer is predicted on the way the Valar and the people of Middle-earth interact by the time of the Lord of the Rings, and an important item to mention is that Sauron would never have come to the level of power that he attained were it not for the fact that Sauron, with pretty much certainty, knew that the Valar would not be coming over those seas. Plus, Sauron is of the mind that no one would ever destroy the ring. He is more concerned that someone will use it to supplant him. It must be said that his suspicion that no one would destroy the ring is pretty much correct after all. Frodo does succumb to the power of the ring on the very bridge where Isildur had stood so long ago and decided to claim the ring for himself as well. At the time of the War of the Ring, Mordor is by far the strongest in Arda, and even the unaffiliated dark creatures are enough to waylay the Fellowship, even if they are not under the orders from Sauron himself. Sauron had every right to feel secure in his position, as getting to Mount Doom and passing by all his thousands of spies, the affiliated evil under his command, not to mention the Black Gate, the Samath Naur, and the lidless eyes which watch through the Tower of Barad-dûr. To think that a small company of potentially elves, men, or even hobbits could even get to that point was one hell of a stretch. It could be thought that if the Valar were in power, Sauron would never be able to get to the power he achieves by the start of this story and the kind of defenses he creates. So why would they be involved? if the ring was sent to Valinor and the Valar were willing to destroy the ring? What kind of precedent does this set for the peoples of Middle-earth? At some point, as we see from the work of noted science fiction author Arthur C. Clarke, childhood must come to an end, and the people's reliance on their greater, far more powerful paternal figures has to give way to some self-reliance. So, Elrond's response is in the vein of understanding. He knows that the time of elves in Middle-earth is coming to an end, and it is time for the age of men to come. The men must be able to account for the way their world is, as it is, without recourse to the Valar or for divine intervention. We have parallels with the voyage of Eärendil too, who took his blessed ship Vignolet to Valinor to present his people's plight to the Valar. There are differences, of course, though. Morgoth could have been said to be of the Valar, and thus partially the Valar's own problem. He is fundamentally not of Middle-earth, and while the same argument could be made of Sauron, he is, after all, nearly godlike in comparison to the rest of the beings in Middle-earth, but godlike does not approach what his master, the first Dark Lord Morgoth, truly was. And also, if you would like to see a video really comparing Sauron and Morgoth, their plans, their ideas, and their powers, then please leave me a comment of the Dark Lords in the comment section below. But anyway, the Valar had to intervene with Morgoth, as it was beyond the ability of men and elves to do so on their own. What the inaction of the Valar in the Third Age might be implicitly saying is that this is not out of the hands of men, that they are up to the charge of standing up to this great evil. In many ways, this is a compliment, that the Valar are ready and willing to leave the men to their own devices and let them decide for themselves what their destiny will be. They sent them a small bit of help in the Istari, and that should be more than enough. Despite how foul and sadistic Sauron truly is, we know that at least Gandalf believes him to be wise. Given this quality, it would be doubtful that a single Maya would be able to match might for might with a single Valar, much less with the whole of Valinor, which is to say though, if they did truly try and send the One Ring across the sea, it is hard to not see it failing. According to the many spies that Sauron has in his back pocket, whether that be the Nazgul, one of them or all, it is likely that he would induce such a bloodletting each time the Fellowship attempted to take the ring over the sea, that it would become like a battle of the Pelennor Fields each and every day, and Sauron would be right to throw all his capable arms at anyone attempting to cross over. Dive-bombing foul beasts swooping down over wooden boats is itself enough to make the trip too costly to attempt and much too costly to achieve. It would be somewhat of an impossible mission. But to round things off for today, we have it from Tolkien himself, from his letters, what exactly Sauron had wished to do if he had won the war. Sauron desired to be a god king, and was held to be this by his servants, and if he had been victorious, he would have demanded divine honor from all rational creatures and absolute temporal power over the whole world. So there we have it. In summary, it would be nearly impossible to get the ring to the Valar. First of all, it is likely that the Valar intend to leave men to their own devices and allow for the children of Ilúvatar to finally grow up and take control of their own destiny. Secondly, Sauron was no fool. He would do all within his considerable power to keep that ring from crossing over to the Undying Lands. Whether this took one battle or 1,000, he would see the realms of Rivendell and beyond utterly destroyed before he allowed that to happen. And instead of marshalling his forces on the fields of Pelennor, he would attempt to siege Rivendell, and with 10 times the numbers that had besieged the Hornburg. And thirdly, and lastly, but certainly not least, if the Fellowship were able to simply put off their problems onto the Valar, it would not only be a very boring story, up there with the possibility of the Eagles simply carrying the Fellowship to Mordor, it would be a very different story and go against the themes of friendship and solidarity and the simple forces of good being able to overcome the forces of evil in the world. Professor Tolkien had a higher opinion of humanity than is sometimes believed, and this final compliment, that we are able to act in our own best interests, put aside our differences, and make our world a better place might just be the greatest compliment ever paid to the audience and fans of this great professor, whose lessons are many and always timely.
In today's video, we will be talking about the most mysterious of the Rings of Power, the 7 rings that were given to the dwarves. So, the Rings of Power were 20 magical rings that were forged during the Second Age, made with the purpose of Sauron having a way to seduce the rulers of Middle-earth to evil. 19 of these 20 rings were forged by the elves of Eregion, led by Celebrimbor. These rings were then divided into 3 groups, 3 for elves, 7 for dwarves, and 9 for men. I'm sure you know how it goes. One additional ring was then created by Sauron himself. The plan was for the 19 other rings to somehow be connected to the power of the One, and their wearers would be controlled by the wielder of the One. Now, if you want to know more about the 1, the 3, or the 9, we have full videos on each of them, so be sure to check them out if you're interested. Now, let's begin with the distribution of the 7 rings. It's most commonly assumed that Sauron created the rings and then divided them between men, elves, and dwarves, as I just stated, but that's not actually the case. Sauron had originally intended for them to all be used to corrupt the elves. But after the creation of the One Ring set his plans into motion, the elves became aware of the situation and took off their rings. Though the 3 most powerful rings were kept hidden and secret, Nenya, Vilya, and Narya, the others were reclaimed. It was then that Sauron decided to attempt to corrupt both men and dwarves as well. Just as intended with his original plans, Sauron gave his so-called gifts to the dwarves for them to wear, then tried corrupting them using his One Ring. Though once again his plan failed. It turns out that not only are the dwarves too hardy and resolute to be controlled and manipulated, but he also gave them to the strongest kings and lords of the race, making it even harder for them to be corrupted. So rather than fall into Sauron's dark magic, the dwarven ring bearers accumulated great wealth. As the rings essentially intensified their greed, they became consumed by it. As the rings were likely given to the kings of the 7 houses of the dwarves, it was because of the 7 rings of power that the dwarves accumulated the 7 hordes of the dwarf kings. In case you are not aware of what these are, they were the legendary treasures of the dwarves. Each horde belonged to one of the dwarven clans. By the time of the Third Age, most of these hordes were plundered or devoured by dragons, who also had a liking for treasure. Due to the rings bringing in wealth and treasure, which in turn attracted dragons, it should come as no surprise to discover that 4 of the 7 rings were melted under the flaming breath of these dragons. However, Sauron managed to recapture the remaining 3 following his return to prominence. He made an attempt to use these 3 rings as a way of bribing the dwarves to pledge their allegiance to him. Of course, this offer was declined. But this begs the question, at least to me, why did Sauron even want these rings back? To just give them back out to dwarves he already knows are incorruptible? It doesn't really make much sense. Tolkien does say that the 7 rings failed to corrupt the dwarven kings the way the 9 rings succeeded with the Nazgul. So I think it's reaching a bit far to suggest that the 7, as originally presented by Sauron to the dwarves, succeeded in turning any of their wearers to evil. The dwarves were especially resistant to the domination of their wills by an external will, but the rings did increase their greed, pride, and anger. So, having seized 3 of the 7, why would Sauron offer them to Dane Ironfoot at the end of the Third Age, as reported by Gloin at the Council of Elrond? If the offer was in fact sincere, we must wonder if Sauron had done something to the rings, perhaps hoping to succeed with them in a way he had not done before. It might also explain why Sauron would be willing to give out the 3 remaining rings to Dane. If he had further perverted the rings, perhaps he felt he would have a better chance of enslaving a dwarven king the second time round. If the dwarves could be united in war once more, Sauron would much have preferred to have them fighting for him than against him. But as we know, the rings were never gifted out again and presumably were destroyed when Barad-dûr collapsed, or at the very least, they likely lost all of their powers when the One Ring was destroyed. Now, I want to talk briefly and more specifically about one of the 7 rings. In fact, it's the only dwarven ring that we ever really get any specific information about, the Ring of Thror. It's actually said that this ring was originally given out by Celebrimbor himself. He gave it to King Durin III of Khazad-dûm. It remained then in the House of Durin for thousands of years, all the way up to the desolation of the Lonely Mountain by Smaug, and at this time the ring was now with Thror. After the kingdom's destruction, Thror passed the ring on to his son Thrain. Eventually, Thrain set out on an ill-fated quest to regain his kingdom, but he was captured by the spies of Sauron, and the Ring of Thror was lost forever, as Sauron took it from him by force in the dungeons of Dol Guldur. Many dwarves, however, did not know the fate of the ring and thought it was lost in Moria when Thror was killed by Azog. It was actually thought that one of the reasons that Balin wished to reclaim Moria was to find this ring. In the Council of Elrond, Gandalf told Gloin that Balin would not find the ring there, as it was given to Thrain and lost in Dol Guldur. Now, that's pretty much all of the information we have on the 7 Rings of Power. As I said, it's one of the areas that Tolkien wrote very little about, but these are often the areas I find most fun to dissect because we can speculate and theorize and piece it together and try and find a full story. The majority of the information we are really given about these rings is summarized in one paragraph from the Silmarillion in the chapter of the Rings of Power. I will leave you today by reading you this passage. And all those rings that he governed he perverted, the more easily since he had a part in their making. And they were accursed, and they betrayed in the end all those that used them. The dwarves indeed proved tough and hard to tame. They ill endure the domination of others, and the thoughts of their hearts are hard to fathom, nor can they be turned to shadows. They used their rings only for the getting of wealth, but wrath and an overmastering greed of gold were kindled in their hearts, of which evil enough after came to the prophet of Sauron. It is said that the foundation of each of the 7 hordes of the dwarf kings of old was a golden ring, but all those hordes long ago were plundered and the dragons devoured them, and of the 7 rings, some were consumed in fire and some Sauron recovered. 3 rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne, in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie, 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them, in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. In today's video, we will be talking about the 3 rings mentioned in the opening line of that quote. The 3 Elven Rings. So, as I'm sure most of you already know, the 3 Elven Rings were a part of the 20 Rings of Power that were forged in the Second Age. These rings were intended to be used by Sauron to corrupt the leaders of Middle-earth to his side. 19 of these 20 rings were forged by the elves in Eregion, led by Celebrimbor. 9 of them were crafted for men, 7 for dwarves, and of course, 3 for the elves. Now, 16 of these rings, Sauron had a direct hand in their creation. However, the greatest of the rings, the 3 Elven Rings, Celebrimbor crafted alone. Then after Sauron made the 1 ring in the fires of Mount Doom, his plan was expected to begin. However, after he put the ruling ring onto his finger, all of the elves instantly became aware of him and removed their rings. Absolutely furious at the unexpected turn of events, Sauron declared war on the elves and demanded that the rings be given back to him. Fortunately, they had already hidden the 3 greatest of the rings, but Sauron managed to recover the other 16. He then gave these to mortals, 7 to dwarves and 9 to men, as he knew they would be easier to bend to his will. As we know, the 9 men eventually became Nazgul and were nothing more than servants to the Dark Lord. The dwarf lords did not fall under Sauron's control, but became overwhelmingly obsessed with treasure. We do actually have a full video on the 9 rings, and I'm sure if you guys want to see it, we will cover one on the 7 Dwarven Rings as well. Let us know in the comments down below. According to Gandalf, a feature of the Rings of Power that seemed to be shared amongst them all was that a mortal that wore one of them was granted a lifespan far greater than their natural one. It's assumed that this side effect was actually unintentional, as the rings were initially intended to be worn by elves, who were of course already immortal. So the 3 Elven Rings were Narya, Nenya, and Vilya. Now, while these rings were not created to be weapons of war, or as a means to dominate others, their purpose was to protect the elven lands where their wielders resided, and to aid in the healing and resisting of evil, although they were still linked to the One Ring in some way, and whoever wore the One Ring could, with great effort, see the thoughts of those who wore the 3. Each of the 3 rings had special properties, but their powers were quite limited. Narya, also known as the Ring of Fire, was a ruby set in a gold band. It was given by Celebrimbor, along with the ring Vilya, to Gil-galad, High King of the Noldor during the Second Age. Gil-galad entrusted Narya to his lieutenant Círdan, Lord of the Havens of Mithlond, who kept it after Gil-galad's death. After the arrival of the Astari in the Third Age, Círdan, who knew of Gandalf's true duties, gave the ring Narya to him to aid him in his quests. "Take this ring, master," he said, "for your labours will be heavy, but it will support you in the weariness that you have taken upon yourself. For this is the Ring of Fire, and with it may you rekindle hearts in a world that grows chill." It was only Círdan, Elrond and Galadriel that knew Gandalf had the ring throughout the Third Age. Not much is known about when or if Gandalf really used its powers, but we do know that during the Siege of Minas Tirith he inspires hope and courage in men wherever he passes. This is a good example of Narya's power. It's said that it had the power to inspire others to resist tyranny, domination and despair, and to hide the wielder from remote observation except by the wearer of the One Ring. It's also thought to have magical properties and fire powers. It's assumed that Gandalf kept the ring as a relic when he journeyed to the Undying Lands. Moving on to Nenya, also known as the White Ring or the Ring of Water. It was the elven ring possessed by Galadriel. It is described as being made of mithril set with a white stone. Nenya's power was said to be preservation, protection and concealment from evil. Galadriel took advantage of these powers by creating and protecting Lothlorien. It's said that, while protected by Nenya, Lothlorien would not fall unless Sauron had personally come to attack it. It's not really clear to me exactly what this power means, as we know that Lorien had definitely been attacked by orcs before, so it doesn't exactly hide it. I would assume it's more of a case of its presence cannot be detected unless Sauron wears the One Ring. Anyway, after the defeat of Sauron, the power of Nenya faded, and with it so did the beauty and magic of Lorien. It was gradually depopulated, and by the time that Arwen went there to die in the Fourth Age, it was deserted and in ruin. Finally, Vilya, also known as the Ring of Air, the Dominant Ring, or the Ring of Sapphire, was the greatest of the three rings. Like the other two elven rings, it was jewelled. It contained a great blue stone set in a gold band. After Sauron destroyed Eregion, Vilya, along with Narya, was sent to Gil-galad far away in Lindon, where it was later given to Elrond by the High Elven King. As Gil-galad was the High King of the Noldor Elves at the time of the ring's distribution, it was thought that he was the most fit to take care of the most powerful of the three rings. So Elrond bore Vilya for the later years of the Second Age, as well as all of the Third. It's not as clear what Vilya can actually do. It's pretty reasonable to assume that it also has the power to heal and preserve, as it's mentioned in the Silmarillion that Celebrimbor actually created the rings for this reason. It has also been speculated that the ring had minor control over some of the elements, like when Elrond summoned water to attack the Nazgul as they attempted to invade Rivendell. It's also possible that it is the ring that gives Elrond the gift of foresight, but it's just as likely that these powers were natural gifts of him alone. After the destruction of the One Ring and Sauron's defeat, the power of Vilya also faded, and it was taken by Elrond, along with Nenya and Narya, with their wielders Galadriel and Gandalf, to the Undying Lands at the end of the Third Age.
We have work to do.
In today's video, we will be looking at Saruman and what his self-given title of Ringmaker truly means. When Gandalf recounts the story of the One Ring to Frodo after years of mysterious comings and goings, checking here and there on Frodo's health, never staying long and never saying much, we eventually learn the cause for his concern. That the One Ring, the Ring of Sauron, had returned, and it was right before his eyes. First coming to Bilbo before being passed on to Frodo, his heir, taken in as a tween after his parents drowned. What Gandalf conveys is that all he had was a suspicion, but that was nothing compared to the knowledge of Saruman, the head of his order and the master of all ring lore. Saruman convinced Gandalf that the One Ring was lost, at the bottom of the sea, but the shadow which fell on Gandalf's heart insisted that this was wrong. How wrong it was he could not know until Saruman betrayed him and their mission at Orthanc. In today's video we are going to look at Saruman the Ringmaker, a name he gave himself, and the Rings of Isengard. First of all, it needs to be said that Isengard, and the larger structure of which is at its centre Orthanc, was not created by or for Saruman, but rather by the Númenóreans in exile after the downfall of Númenor and their coming to Middle-earth in Gondor and Arnor. Isengard was built between 3320 of the Second Age and the time of the War of the Last Alliance in 3430. It was in the northwest of the Kingdom of Gondor and was purposed as a guard to the fords of Isen, and as such was gifted to Saruman the White by the steward of Gondor, Beren, thinking the wizard would be a strong ally and buffer against the threat of the Dunlendins, who, as people, were in constant conflict with Rohan, and so with their ally of Gondor as well. Saruman was intended to be a steward of Orthanc, not its master, much in the same way the stewards of Gondor were guards for and not heirs to the royalty that they kept vacant until such a time a king should return and prove worthy. We can make some interesting comparisons between the steward of Gondor at the time of the War of the Ring, Denethor, and Saruman himself. Denethor, who told his son when asked that 10,000 years would not be sufficient enough time for a steward to take power as king in such a land as Gondor. Saruman was less scrupulous than Denethor though. Here we are talking about a man who went mad and attempted to set himself and his son on fire. The difference between them goes even further, however. For example, while Saruman was corrupted through his intention with Sauron through the Palantiri, Denethor waged a war of wills against the Dark Lord for nigh on 30 years before he broke, and when he broke, he still did not turn to the side of Sauron. Despite losing his critical faculty and despairing of all hope, he never turned to evil. As for Saruman, we know that he acted as though he was on Sauron's side, though he was desperately seeking out the ring for himself. When the Nazgul pass by Orthanc and they encounter Grima, Saruman speaks to their very thought and tells them that he knows what they are looking for. And though, if he had it, he tells them, he would not need to say so. Rather, they would throw themselves at his feet and name him Lord. This speaks to Saruman's ultimate aspirations, and not least of all his aspiration to own the One Ring itself, but to forge the rings of power of his own sorcery and lore, all of which in his new home of secrecy and power, Orthanc. Saruman refers to himself as Ringmaker, and we are unwilling to trust the word of a known traitor and liar. We can trust Gandalf, who notes on numerous occasions that Saruman is wearing a ring. It is Gandalf who recounts the series of events from which the name Saruman of Many Colours originated. But I rode to the foot of Orthanc, and came to the stair of Saruman, and there he met me and led me up to his high chamber. He wore a ring on his finger. I am Saruman the Wise, Saruman Ringmaker, Saruman of Many Colours. Now remember, it was Gandalf who told us that his intuition was nothing against the stature of Saruman in his studies of ring lore, as he had long studied what was his domain of study, while Gandalf had only an inclination, and in such a position he did not think just intuition was enough to go against the head of his order, as Gandalf was an honourable and noble spirit. Not exactly words that one would use to describe Saruman, whether he be white or many-coloured. It is possible that what Gandalf sees on Saruman's finger was a taunt, a feint, a way to convey strength that is purely illusionary. In keeping with the powers of his voice, he attempts to use at several times in the story, most prominently against Theoden, when their company rise to Isengard after the Battle of Helm's Deep. Theoden is able to shrug off Saruman's attempts at undermining Gandalf and his position, but only just, and only after Theoden's men begin murmuring in agreement with Saruman among themselves. It is in keeping with Saruman's character that he would wear a ring without powers as a means of conveying power, just as he was to proclaim himself no longer Saruman the White, but Saruman of Many Colours. He was not satisfied with his lot and intended to increase his power at whatever price. Treason, murder, whatever it took, he intended to be master. As Sauron suspected of all people who would oppose him, he would attempt to use the ring against Sauron and replace him, not destroy the ring to rid the world of evil. There was a problem though. It might be that he would need to get his hands on the One Ring itself to reverse engineer it, and as a master of ring lore, it is likely he knew that if he attempted to wield the One Ring, it might not serve him as it did Sauron. But in the time he had, the years, decades or centuries with which he had to inquire into the lore and the craft, certainly he would learn of Celebrimbor, the forging of the Rings of Power, and all that we would come to learn throughout the book. What is in the province of the wise would be something expected of Saruman to know, lest he be no longer counted among the wise. It is perhaps this egotism that drove Saruman astray. We know that from his time coming into the world, when Círdan gave the Ring of Fire to Gandalf, Saruman was furious and undoubtedly never forgot this slight on his person, his worthiness and his ability. At the time of the Lord of the Rings, when we first meet him, it is likely that he is already in a race against time to either acquire the ring by way of sending his own agents out of Orthanc to acquire it, as we know that there were the three groups of orcs that the three hunters pursued, those of Mordor, those of Isengard, and those unaffiliated orcs of Moria, who followed after the Fellowship to avenge the death of their chieftain, who was killed by a member of the Fellowship. With the orcs of Isengard wanting to return them to Saruman, the orcs of Mordor obviously wanted to return them to Mordor, to Sauron. The unaffiliated orcs were just in a blood feud with the Fellowship and had little concern about rings, only the blood of their enemies to avenge their fallen comrade. Interestingly, in this scenario of a Maya and a member of the Astari, only this one group of orcs acted selflessly and noble among those three groups. When the orcs are the high-minded group in any party, something has gone horribly wrong. This brings us back to what is one of the central thematic elements of The Lord of the Rings, and a thematic thread which runs through the whole of the work. The ambitious and selfish are doomed to fail because they will be blinded by their ego, by their ambitions, and lose objectivity of thought and become blinded to the dangers and the risk of what they seek. Again and again, what is meant to empower someone is often what becomes their prison. As the 9 mortal men who wasted away and became wraiths, their pursuit of power drained them of life entirely, to the point they only hold shape by covering their fell spirits in black cloaks. The Tower of Isengard itself, bequeathed to Saruman as an ally by the Steward Beren, first became a symbol of strength and fortification, and at the story's end, the Ents have Saruman trapped within those very walls. And what's worse, he's stuck inside with Grima Wormtongue, and since Grima threw the Palantiri out of the window trying to strike Gandalf, he has no one else to talk to, though he eventually gets to leave, only to later meet his end by Wormtongue's blade. What power he sought that was beyond his nature sent him down a path of corruption, blackening his soul and stripping him of any right to the position which was conferred upon him. Just as the Silmarils were so hotly pursued by the Sons of Fëanor, they had done so much evil in their pursuit that when they finally acquired the Hallowed Gems, they burned their hands. The wickedness of their deeds in seeking the Silmarils made them unworthy of possessing them. So it is with Saruman, the wickedness of his pursuit made him unworthy of his position, and when his body burned away and turned to ash, scattering in the wind, we see the end to all such missions in Middle-earth, because in this world it is so ordered by Eru Ilúvatar that despite the presence of evil, goodness will prevail. Saruman was a spiteful, grudge-bearing and deeply envious being. His pursuit of the ring was purely for his own purposes, to make himself master of Middle-earth, to supplant Sauron by using the One Ring, or one like it, against the Dark Lord so that he could take his place. Unlike Galadriel, who was able to resist the temptation of the ring when Frodo offered it to her, Saruman would not need to be asked twice. And for that, he will always be, as Maglor and Maithros and the Silmarils, unworthy of that which he sought, because the actions necessary to acquire their ends rendered it impossible for them to ever achieve it. So there we have it, Saruman the White, Saruman of many colours, a powerful being whose greed blinded him to the evil of his deeds. What might have been had he acquired the One Ring we will never know, but it is likely that he would have become a thrall of Sauron, just as we see over and over again. The source of what he believed to be ultimate power would in this instance become his ultimate prison. He became a master of ring lore, almost unmatched in his knowledge of a potential powerful and deadly craft. There may have been a Ring of Isengard, but that is referring to the stone wall around the area that holds Orthanc. However, Saruman was still proud enough to call himself Ringmaker. Even he wasn't on the level of Sauron, at least not by the time of the War of the Ring. Who knows how far he could have gone had he never been defeated.
SAMWISE GAMGEE, the Ringbearer, the Guardian. Hello and welcome to The Broken Sword, your YouTube home for all things The Lord of the Rings and J.R.R. Tolkien. Today we are looking at how SAMWISE GAMGEE was able to resist the magical powers of the One Ring. One of the many qualities of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit is its vast and diverse cast of characters. Of them, there are classic heroes, such as your Aragorns and Boromirs, or Theodens and Éomirs, men who represent the height of power, bravery, and honour. Perhaps one character who is often overlooked is the much beloved Samwise Gamgee, humble son to a humble servant, as his father is quick to defend Bilbo Baggins against the barbs of the townsfolk when the tongues are wagging in the local pubs. Sam is equally quick to defend Master Frodo Baggins from the barbs of the great spider Shelob and defy the great dark creature who has been around for thousands of years to see his friend and their cause to a happy end. Yet, a great man such as Boromir gave in to the temptation of the power of the One Ring, and Sam did not. Or did he? At least not completely. But how? What can we see from the texts that show us why Samwise was above the likes of Boromir, the captain of the White Tower? Time and again, Sam proves suited to his charge. The moment where he really shines takes place at the conclusion of the Two Towers book, or you may know it from the Return of the King movie. With Frodo paralysed and dead by the looks of it, Sam must overcome the dreadful Shelob after Frodo is waylaid. With one sting, Frodo is paralytic and cold, dead by the pallor of his face. In this moment, Sam knows that he must act, despite his uncertainty, whatever may come. He is stricken by guilt at the thought of taking the ring from Frodo, as it was never trusted to him in explicit terms. In the end, he decides the burden is his now, as he sees no other way to continue this fight. There is some debate among fans though at this point of just how long Sam actually wears the ring for. At that moment, this one hobbit is able to summon all his courage and will, in the face of not just a wounded and potentially dead comrade, but a potentially dead best friend, and somehow save the entire world. He decides to carry the ring into Mordor, on his own. He would simply walk into and through Mordor. Take that, Boromir.
One does not simply walk into Mordor.
A group of orcs seize the limp and frigid Frodo and carry him away, while Sam is left to now understand these orcs, but alone for a moment. The temptation of the ring is upon him with force and speed. The ring's magic begins to invoke visions. Sam sees himself now as a true hero, Samwise the Strong, hero of the age, and his blade goes before him alight with flame as he drives the darkness back. Armies surrender and join him. They flock to his banner as he marched to destroy the fortress of Barad-dûr. In his most heroic moment, driving back a spider of great terror, he is tempted by visions of what the ring could give him. The life of a hero as he understands the word, like the people in those stories of which he remains so fond. Sam does experience temptation, but he is able to resist. This is no small accomplishment, as we see very few characters able to resist it, such as Galadriel, who is much more powerful in lore and the arts of someone like Melian, but no one outside the race of the halflings would endure the ring as long as the likes as Frodo, or Bilbo, or even Gollum. And we see what it did to Frodo, costing him his great love, the Shire, in the end. And not to mention Gollum as well, the ring would cost him his life. And we must understand this is not a mere magic ring, it is the one that works on the minds of those nearest it. It actively manipulates and seduces those who would bear it, as it possesses the spirit and is of the sorcery of Sauron. To contend with the ring is not unlike contending with Sauron himself. Frodo was unable in the end to resist temptation, but he had done all he could. He had gone far further than nearly anybody else thought possible, and his failure should be seen in this light. Maybe not as a failure, but one hell of an achievement. His thought turned to the ring, but there was no comfort there, only dread and danger. No sooner had he come in sight of Mount Doom, burning far away, than he was aware of a change in his burden. As it drew near the great furnaces where, in the deeps of time, it had been shaped and forged, the ring's power grew, and it became more fell, untamable save by some mighty will. As Sam stood there, even though the ring was not on him but hanging by its chain about his neck, he felt himself enlarged, as if he were robed in a huge distorted shadow of himself. A vast and ominous threat halted upon the walls of Mordor. He felt that he had from now on only two choices: to forbear the ring, though it would torment him, or to claim it, and challenge the power that sat in its dark hold beyond the Valley of Shadows. Already the ring tempted him, gnawing at his will and reason. Wild fantasies arose in his mind, and he saw Samwise the Strong, hero of the age, striding with a flaming sword across the darkened land, and armies flocking to his call as he marched to the overthrow of Barad-dûr. And then all the clouds rolled away, and the white sun shone, and at his command the Vale of Gorgoroth became a garden of flowers and trees and brought forth fruit. He had only to put on the ring and claim it for his own, and all this could be. Sam is not taken by this illusion, and the image of green and good and the Shire's rustic life in lower case, wherein their lives might be right small on the broad pages of history. In their own shires and hobbit holes, each are heroic and valued in their quest. The one small garden of a free gardener was all his need and due, not a garden swollen to a realm, his own hands to use, not the hands of others to command. Another debate among fans concerns Sam's initial hesitance to return the ring to Frodo, whether it is the residual magic of the ring which urges him on, or the concern for his friend. Now that he is fully aware of what carrying the ring means, what it feels like, and what this burden truly is, does he want to give this back to his master and see him slowly breaking even further? We could see it either way, but Sam is pure. He is great at heart. That last quote shows he doesn't need a realm, just a small garden that he can tend to himself. This doesn't sound like someone who is going to steal the ring, more someone who is concerned for Frodo. As someone who works closely with the earth, his father was similarly grounded. He was a salt of the earth type, possessed by dignity of honest labour and the keeping of the faith between family and acquaintances. Keeping the faith has a special meaning here, as we learn how Sam was able to resist the magic of the ring and the will of Sauron. In that hour of trial, it was the love of his master that helped most to hold him firm. But also deep down in him lived still unconquered his plain hobbit sense. He knew in the core of his heart that he was not large enough to bear such a burden, even if such visions were not a mere cheat to betray him. Afterwards, Sam would offer to carry the ring at least twice. Once, shortly after he returns it, and again later when he sees the extent of Frodo's pain. Whether he is motivated by desire, that of possession and greed, or of pity and compassion is not spelled out and is ambiguous for a reason. The joy of literature is that of engaging the text and trying to understand them as best we can, and some answers are not definite, some experiences forever ambiguous and vague. It is possible Sam's motivations are somewhere between pity for Frodo and the magic of the ring, but honestly, here, we will hear nothing against Sam, as there is an argument to be made that he is the true hero of The Lord of the Rings and the character Tolkien most adored. I mean, I have put out a video on Samwise being the true hero of The Lord of the Rings, so if you haven't seen it and you like the idea, please go and check that out. But that he sees the return of the ring as a burden to his master, we very much think this speaks strongly to the subtlety of the ring's magic and the vastness of Sauron's ability to deceive and consume, really playing on Sam's true feelings. But it also makes you question, is there anything more powerful than Sam's true loyalty?
That's for Frodo! And for the Shire! And that's for my own gather!
So there we have it, a look into just how an everyday hobbit, a gardener, not a warrior or king, was able to resist the lure of the One Ring. Some may try and dismiss this as just Sam didn't have the ring for long, so it couldn't have affected him too bad. However, remember, he was in close proximity to the ring for the entire journey. A man such as Boromir gave in to this far sooner for far shorter a time. So not only did Sam carry the ring directly, wore the ring directly, he was also in close proximity to it for a very long time too. The will of such a good and simple hobbit, and I do mean that in the best way, is what makes Sam so great and shows why he was able to resist it. You couldn't tempt him with a realm of beautiful gardens. He just needed that one small garden to tend to that he could put all his love and use his own hands to tend. And that is what makes Sam so great. He is the person we all wish we were, and he's the best friend we all wish we had. And it's one of the reasons why Samwise Gamgee is one of the greatest characters Tolkien ever created. Boromir, the valiant warrior of Gondor, the man who fell to the pull of the One Ring. He's often seen as a tragic figure, someone who let ambition cloud his judgment. But was he actually wrong? Was Boromir's belief that the ring should be used against Sauron a reckless mistake, or was it the real best chance Middle-earth had at survival? What if he was the one who saw the truth? From the moment Boromir joins the Fellowship, his stance on the One Ring is clear. Why destroy such a powerful weapon when it could be wielded against Sauron? Gondor had been fighting a desperate war for generations, holding back the forces of Mordor with dwindling strength. To Boromir, the ring wasn't just an evil relic, it was a potential weapon that could turn the tide. And, in a way, he had a point. The Free Peoples were losing. Gondor stood as the last stronghold against Mordor, but even with its defences, it had been slowly crumbling. Minas Ithil had long since fallen and become Minas Morgul. The enemy's forces were growing, and now war was imminent. The world was changing, and to Boromir, the old ways of resistance were no longer enough. The ring had always shown its power, so why not use it? The Dark Lord himself had once wielded it to conquer the Free Peoples. Surely a strong and noble leader could do the same to destroy him. Boromir believed that with the right mind and the right strength, the ring's power could be harnessed for good. From a purely strategic standpoint, his logic is difficult to ignore. But where his argument begins to unravel is in the nature of the ring itself. Unlike a normal weapon, the One Ring does not simply grant power to its wielder. It corrupts, bends wills, and serves its true master. No one, not even a king, a hero, or a warrior as noble as Boromir, could wield it without being changed. Gandalf, Elrond, and Galadriel all refused it, not out of weakness, but because they understood its true nature. Boromir's desire to defend Gondor was genuine, but his belief that he or anyone could control the ring was where he was probably mistaken. However, it is important to note that his argument was not born out of selfishness or greed. It was out of duty, desperation, and the immense burden he carried as Gondor's heir. So, was he truly wrong to think the ring could be used as a weapon, or was he just the only one willing to take that gamble that others feared? Boromir's argument wasn't just compelling, it was dangerous. Not because it lacked logic, but because it was exactly the kind of reasoning the ring itself wanted people to believe. This is the insidious nature of Sauron's creation. The ring doesn't just offer power, it twists perception, making its influence feel like wisdom rather than manipulation. And this is where Boromir's downfall truly begins. The ring didn't force itself upon him, nor did he seek it out purely for personal gain. But slowly, subtly, it planted doubts, fed his pride, and amplified his fears. Tolkien rarely portrays the ring's effect as a sudden or violent transformation. Instead, it works like a whisper, nudging thoughts in a dangerous direction. Consider Boromir's initial reaction to the ring during the Council of Elrond. He does not outright demand its use. Instead, he simply questions whether destruction is truly the best course of action. Why do you speak ever of hiding and destroying? Why should we not think that the Great Ring has come into our hands to serve us in the very hour of need? At first, this pretty much sounds reasonable, but over time, this doubt grows into something more, a fixation. During the Fellowship's journey, Boromir's thoughts become increasingly centered on the ring and what it could accomplish. By the time they reach the banks of the Anduin, his desperation has truly taken hold. This wasn't just a warrior contemplating strategy anymore. Boromir had become obsessed. The ring had worked its way into his heart, making its theft seem not just tempting, but necessary. But here's the key thing. Boromir still wasn't evil. He wasn't a villain in this story. His fall was not because of a lust for power, but because he genuinely believed the ring could save his people. His mistake was thinking that he could control it. This is something Tolkien emphasizes throughout The Lord of the Rings. The greatest heroes are not those who seek power, but those who recognize its danger. Gandalf, Galadriel, Elrond, They're the types to refuse the ring because they knew what Boromir could not.
Could have been mine. It should be mine. Give it to me.
That thought, once planted, would always grow. But despite everything, Boromir's tragedy does not end in corruption, it ends in redemption. Because unlike others who fell to the ring's temptation, Boromir recognized his mistake before it was too late. But was his final moment of clarity enough to change how we judge him? Boromir's fall to the ring's temptation is one of the most devastating moments in The Lord of the Rings. But what sets him apart from others who were corrupted, like Gollum or even Isildur, is that he realizes his mistake and fights to redeem himself. After Frodo escapes him, Boromir isn't consumed by anger or further temptation. Instead, he immediately recognizes the horror of what he has done. He doesn't try to justify his actions, nor does he continue pursuing Frodo. Instead, he returns to Aragorn, shaken and ashamed. When Aragorn finds him in the woods, Boromir is not the proud, confident captain of Gondor anymore. He is a man broken by his own failure. Yet instead of running or wallowing in regret, he does the only thing left to him. He fights. The Fellowship was always going to break apart, but the attack by Saruman's Uruk-hai accelerates the chaos. With Frodo gone, the remaining members of the Fellowship find themselves overwhelmed, and Boromir, he is the only one standing between the enemy and Merry and Pippin. This is where Boromir's true heroism shines. Despite being wounded by multiple arrows, Boromir refuses to fall. He fights on, not for glory or power, but to protect his friends. It is a direct contrast to his earlier moment of weakness. Just as he tried to take the ring from Frodo, now he gives everything to defend those who can no longer defend themselves. Tolkien describes his final moments with devastating clarity. A mile, maybe, from Parth Galen in a little glade not far from the lake he found Boromir. He was sitting with his back to a great tree, as if he was resting. But Aragorn saw that he was pierced with many black-feathered arrows. His sword was still in his hand, but it was broken near the hilt. His horn cloven in two was at his side. Many orcs lay slain, piled all about him and at his feet. Even as those orcs drag Merry and Pippin away, even as he collapses, Boromir would not have given up. His last act is not one of failure, but of defiance. Boromir's death scene is one of the most emotional moments in The Lord of the Rings. Aragorn finds him too late to save him, but just in time to hear his final words. I tried to take the ring from Frodo. I am sorry. I have paid. Boromir doesn't seek forgiveness. He doesn't make excuses. He accepts his failure completely, and yet his final words also reaffirm his true nature.
My captain. My king.
These words are a complete transformation from the man who doubted Aragorn at the Council of Elrond. In his dying breath, Boromir acknowledges Aragorn's rightful place as the leader of Gondor. He surrenders his own pride, not because he is forced to, but because he finally sees clearly. His last act is not one of ambition, but of true loyalty. Boromir may have stumbled, but in the end, he died a hero. But was his failure inevitable? Could he have ever resisted the ring? Or was he always doomed from the moment he set his eyes upon it? Boromir's death is an act of redemption, but it leaves an important question. Was his downfall inevitable? Could he have ever resisted the ring's power, or was he doomed from the moment he set out from Gondor? To understand Boromir's fate, we must recognise that he was fighting a war before the quest began. Unlike Frodo, who was thrust into adventure from the quiet of the Shire, Boromir was already a leader, a warrior, and a man under immense pressure. Gondor was losing the war, remember. Osgiliath had fallen, the shadow was creeping ever closer, and his people were dying. No aid was coming either. With all of this weighing on him, Boromir saw that one ring as a tool, not a burden. He wasn't trying to betray Frodo, remember that. He was trying to save his home. But therein lies the danger. The ring does not corrupt through malice, but through desire. It preys on strength, not just weakness. Boromir was not a coward like Gollum, nor was he power-hungry like Sauron. He was that man who wanted to do what was right, but the ring, that is what twists even the noblest of intentions. Let's compare his descent with the others who fell to the ring's influence. You have Isildur, who took the ring willingly and refused to destroy it, believing he could wield it without consequence. Then you have Gollum, instantly obsessed. He killed for it and was enslaved by its power for centuries. And what about perhaps Denethor? He never even touched the ring, yet the mere idea of it, combined with Sauron's influence, drove him to madness. Boromir, however, fought against it for months. His final breaking point only came at Amon Hen, where the ring's influence was at its strongest. In that moment, he believed he was acting for the greater good, not for personal gain. But the truth is, no one could have wielded the ring against Sauron, not even the greatest of men. Boromir's death was tragic, but it also prevented a greater tragedy. By falling in battle, he was remembered as a hero, not a cautionary tale. He died protecting others, not consumed by the lust for power. At the end of the day, he made the right choice, not by resisting the ring entirely, but by realizing his mistake before it was too late. And that makes Boromir one of the most realistic and compelling characters in Tolkien's Legendarium. And so, there we have it. Was Boromir actually right about the One Ring? On the surface, his logic made sense. Gondor needed strength, the Free Peoples were outmatched, and the ring seemed like the only weapon powerful enough to turn the tide. But Tolkien's world does not reward power for power's sake. The ring could never be used, it could only use its wielder. Boromir's belief that the ring should be wielded was not a failure of intelligence or courage, it was a failure of understanding. And yet, in his final moments, he proves what kind of man he truly is. Not a villain, not a fool, but a hero. A flawed, tragic, and deeply human hero. The One Ring. Within the Lord of the Rings saga, the moment we are looking at today arises when Gandalf suggests to Frodo that forcibly taking the One Ring from him would break his mind. This is a really intriguing concept from the book, so please sit back, relax, and enjoy the video.
I am not trying to rob you. I'm trying to help you.
This all starts in the Shadow of the Past chapter. Gandalf talks to Frodo about how Bilbo first claimed the One Ring and the power it quickly had over him. Gandalf explains how, I could not take it from him without doing greater harm, and I had no right to do so anyway. And then 12 pages later in the same chapter, Gandalf tells Frodo after seeing how it was already clawing its influence onto him, and I could not make you except by force, which would break your mind. Before delving into the potential repercussions of Gandalf forcibly taking the One Ring from Frodo, it is imperative to understand the complexities surrounding the ring. This is not a mere trinket, it is a device steeped in dark magic. Gandalf, possessing more of a deep understanding than most of such artifacts, perceives aspects of the ring's influence that might elude the comprehension of the likes of hobbits or men. This is evident when he arrives at Rivendell and probes Frodo's thoughts during the latter's slumber to gather insights about the events leading up to that moment. Although we must admit Gandalf does apologise for this intrusion, as it is seen as quite improper. Wrestling it away could be devastating though, considering the immense psychological attachment one could form with the ring. Recall Gandalf's painstaking efforts with Bilbo, employing logic and enchantment to persuade him to part with the ring. Throughout their conversation, Gandalf's eyes occasionally gleam, a detail that Tolkien really does draw our attention to. This phenomenon bears similarities to when Gandalf has his actions at Meduseld, the Golden Hall in Edoras, when he liberates Theoden King from Saruman's influence. In both scenarios, even when dealing with resolute individuals, Gandalf masterfully combines empathy and the mystical properties of his voice to attain his objective. But back to Bilbo, recalling the intense confrontation with him and Gandalf highlights the profound influence of the ring. In that heated moment, Bilbo, seemingly consumed by the ring's power, very nearly draws his sword against Gandalf, one of his oldest and most loyal friends. The incident paints a vivid image of Bilbo, a man teetering on the edge of emotional collapse. Gandalf, aware of the delicate state Bilbo is in, approaches this situation then with caution. As he later confides in Frodo, forcibly taking the ring might have left Bilbo so devastated that he couldn't have even been able to journey to Rivendell on his own. J.R.R. Tolkien's works often revolve around the moral choices of characters when confronted with great power. The One Ring itself, a symbol of unbridled power and seduction, serves as a touchstone for these ethical dilemmas. To forcibly take the ring from someone is not merely a physical act, but also a deeply moral violation. It would strip the bearer of their agency, disregarding the complex bond and internal struggles they experience with the ring's pull. Gandalf's decision to refrain from taking the ring from Frodo by force can be viewed as an embodiment of one of Tolkien's recurring themes, the respect for individual free will and the peril of domination. By recognizing the sanctity of Frodo's relationship with the ring, regardless of how destructive it might be, Gandalf is adhering to a higher moral standing. This theme is also evident in other aspects of the narrative, such as the reluctance of the wise to use the ring for their purposes, fearing its corrupting influence. In the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, the author touches upon the theme of domination and moral choice. He writes, "The story is cast in terms of a good side and a bad side, beauty against ruthless ugliness, tyranny against kingship, moderated freedom with consent against compulsion that has long lost any object save mere power." This quote shows Tolkien's aversion to unbridled power and domination. Gandalf's refusal to employ force mirrors his way of thinking, emphasizing the significance of moral agency even in the face of world-altering power. A valuable resource in understanding the intricacies of such interactions are, again, the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, those ones that were curated and published in 1981 by his son Christopher. One particular letter that we will look at quite deeply today was penned in September of 1963 and addressed to a Mrs. Eileen Alger. Here, Tolkien responds to a comment about Frodo's failure to relinquish the ring at the cracks of doom. This topic is also one that really could be dived into far more deeper in a future video, and it is one I'd love to do, so just drop me a like on the video and a comment of Frodo's failure down below if you would like to see that made. But anyway, within this letter lies a trove of insights regarding the One Ring and its influence on the members of the Fellowship. Particularly striking is Tolkien's commentary on Frodo's inability to part with it. Frodo undertook his quest out of love, to save the world he knew from disaster at his own expense if he could, and also in complete humility, acknowledging that he was wholly inadequate to the task. His real contract was only to do what he could, to try to find a way, and to go as far on the road as his strength of mind and body allowed. He did that. I do not myself see that the breaking of his mind and will under demonic pressure after torment was any more a moral failure than the breaking of his body would have been, say, by being strangled by Gollum or crushed by a falling rock. That appears to have been the judgment of Gandalf and Aragorn, and of all who learned the full story of his journey. Certainly, nothing would be concealed by Frodo, but what Frodo himself felt about the events is quite another matter.
It's been 4 years to the day since Weathertop, Sam. It's never really healed.
It is interesting to see how Tolkien himself does not see it as a moral failure. And then, if we carry on in the next passage, we understand how much damage Frodo took in his role as ring bearer, and how he feels about his failings, and the effects which linger on, disappointment despite ultimate success, those invisible scars which war inflict on the soul of a person who does go to war. He appears at first to have no sense of guilt. He was restored to sanity and peace. But then he thought that he had given his life in sacrifice. He expected to die very soon. But he did not, and one could observe the disquiet growing in him. Arwen was first to observe the signs, and gave him her jewel for comfort, and thought of a way of healing him. Slowly he fades out of the picture, saying and doing less and less. I think it is clear on reflection to an attentive reader that when his dark times came upon him, and he was conscious of being wounded by knife sting and tooth and a long burden, it was not only nightmare memories of past horrors that afflicted him, but also unreasoning self-reproach. He saw himself and all that he'd done as a broken failure. Tolkien goes on to clarify what Frodo means, what such thoughts were, and where they may have came from. He explains how there were two primary temptations to internal conflicts Frodo grappled with. One, a lingering sense of pride, which manifested as a desire for recognition and to return as a hero rather than simply serving as an instrument of good. And two, a more profound struggle where, despite the ring's destruction, Frodo still felt attached to it. He hadn't voluntarily cast it away, the part of him regretted its loss and continued to yearn for it. In essence, he emphasizes how different the complex nature of Frodo's internal battle and the nuanced relationship he had with the ring really were. When it comes down to it, in the moment of realization that it is over, that the dominion of mind, body and spirit which the ring held over him had passed, and he mourns its passing. He says, "It is gone forever, and now all is dark and empty." Again, from that same letter we learn how Tolkien understands the ring and the way it acts on people it intends to ensnare and enslave, as he says. It was part of the essential deceit of the ring to fill minds with imaginations of supreme power, but this the great had well considered and had rejected, as is seen in Elrond's words at the council. Galadriel's rejection of the temptation was founded upon previous thought and resolve. In any case, Elrond or Galadriel would have proceeded in the policy now adopted by Sauron. They would have built an empire with great and absolutely subservient generals and armies and engines of war until they could challenge Sauron and destroy him by force. Confrontation of Sauron alone, unaided, self to self was not contemplated. One can imagine the scene in which Gandalf, say, was placed in such a position. It would be a delicate balance. On one side, the true allegiance of the ring to Sauron, on the other, superior strength because Sauron was not actually in possession, and perhaps also because he was weakened by long corruption and expenditure of will in dominating inferiors. If Gandalf proved the victor, the result would have been for Sauron the same as the destruction of the ring. For him, it would have been destroyed, taken from him forever. But the ring and all its works would have endured. It would have been the master in the end. The One Ring's hold is akin to a potent addiction. It seduces its bearers with promises of grandeur, only to plunge them into profound despair. As Frodo laments, all is dark and empty, suggesting we might need to reevaluate the depths of the ring's grip on him by the time he must relinquish it. Tolkien underscores the lingering wounds left by the ring, quoting Gandalf, "Alas, there are some wounds that cannot be wholly cured." It is evident that the ring ensnares Frodo in a mental rather than physical prison. This different kind of entrapment may explain why Gandalf couldn't exert the same subtle influence on Frodo as he did on Bilbo. Recall again the tense standoff when Bilbo, under the ring's magic, goes to draw his sword against Gandalf, his closest ally. That confrontation offers a glimpse into the subtle, almost invisible magic Gandalf uses, attempting to gently unravel the ring's deep-seated hold on Bilbo's soul. Using force might inflict irrevocable mental trauma, which Gandalf is, obviously, keen to avoid. If we take this time now, though, to look at that final moment of truth, when the ring finally conquers the will of Frodo Baggins once and for all. A wild light came into Frodo's eyes. "Stand away, don't touch me," he cried. "It is mine, I say, be off." His hand strayed to his sword hilt, but then quickly his voice changed. No, Sam," he said sadly. "But you must understand, it is my burden and no one else can bear it. It is too late now, Sam dear. You can't help me in that way again. I am almost in its power now. I could not give it up, and if you tried to take it, I should go mad." Professor Tolkien's narrative exhibits meticulous care, revisiting a poignant concern from Chapter 2, The Shadow of the Past, when Frodo first receives the ring. The story culminates in Frodo's eventual breaking, albeit not at Gandalf's hands. The ring, with its insidious influence, weaves intricate webs within the psyche of its bearer, initiating a process of mental subjugation from the moment it starts interacting with Frodo. To the ring, Frodo becomes an involuntary accomplice in its designs. It successfully dominates Frodo at a crucial juncture, and had it not been for Gollum, who retained his obsession and emotional chains even after years without the ring, events might have unfolded differently. Frodo Baggins gave his all, journeying to the furthest reaches that his hobbit heart and feet could endure. When we quickly reflect on Gollum with this all too, we see in him a chilling mirror image of Frodo's potential fate, a stark reminder of the internal battles waged and the dire outcomes if one were to yield to the ring's temptations. Once Gollum had not been all that different from Frodo. However, his extended possession of the ring altered him to such an extent that he grew to despise the sun's light, and his relentless yearning drove him to dwell in the shadows and later to stalk the Fellowship. His obsession reached its zenith at Mount Doom, where he, consumed by his desires, met his doom along with the very object of his infatuation. It paints a heart-wrenching picture of the overpowering nature of addiction, which leaves marks not just on the body, but also gnaws away at the soul. In the face of Gollum's end, Frodo's ability to ward off the ring's seductive pull stands out even more distinctly. With each step on his hazardous voyage, the ring's enticements intensified, and the looming threat of Gollum's eventual fate shadowed him. Yet, Frodo, an unassuming hobbit by all accounts, bore its burden longer than most could have anticipated. This speaks volumes of the might of his spirit and his unwavering resolve. When juxtaposed with other iconic figures from Middle-earth, his commendable resilience is further magnified. Frodo's susceptibilities in no way lessen our admiration for him. Tolkien's musing on how even Gandalf, arguably the most wise and formidable being of his era, might have wavered under the ring's burden too, makes it all the more clearer. Casting blame upon our fearless hobbit seems almost unthinkable. Tolkien's profound message underscores the dire consequences of unchecked ambition and greed. Beyond its superficial allure, the Ring of Power is a malevolent shackle, insidiously embedding itself within its bearer's psyche. Separating the ring from its possessor becomes as intricate as extracting gum from hair. If Gandalf were to employ brute force, the repercussions could be disastrous. The narrative repeatedly illustrates that raw power is distinct from true strength, just as cleverness differs from wisdom. A central theme woven through the ring's journey shows that the journey's means are as vital as its end. Tolkien concludes his letter emphasizing this very sentiment. If Gandalf proved the victor, the result would have been for Sauron the same as the destruction of the ring. For him it would have been destroyed, taken from him forever. But the ring and all its works would have endured. It would have been the master in the end. Gandalf as Ring Lord would have been far worse than Sauron. He would have remained righteous, but self-righteous. He would have continued to rule and order things for good, and the benefit of his subject according to his wisdom, which was and would have remained great. Gandalf's caution to Frodo about the dire consequence of forcibly taking the ring sheds light on the ring's formidable power and how it insidiously ensnares its bearer. It's an allegory of the profound harm that can ensue from abrupt intervention, akin to hastily removing an arrow and worsening the wound. Crucially, the letter emphasizes that vanquishing Sauron requires more than just adopting his methods. True conquest over malice, fear, and hatred comes through love, courage, and hope. This profound wisdom is one of the myriad of insights Tolkien bequeaths to us, enhancing our understanding and enriching our lives.
The ring is yours now. Put it somewhere out of sight.
So there we have it. Tolkien's narrative of Gandalf and Frodo's relationship in the context of the One Ring's immense power is a study in restraint, understanding, and the profound complexities of the human spirit. Gandalf's wisdom prevented him from forcibly taking the ring, recognizing that such an act could shatter Frodo's mind. Instead, the Hobbit's internal resilience and quiet courage carried the weight of Middle-earth's fate. With Gollum as a constant, grim reflection of the potential corruption, the story underscores the danger of unchecked ambition. In Gandalf's prudence and Frodo's sacrifice, Tolkien illustrates that true victory lies not in domination, but in compassion, understanding, and the strength of spirit. What if a Balrog took the One Ring? That is what we are looking at today. We are looking at this interesting what if today since we had great fun creating our video of what might happen if Tom Yellowboots Bombadil and Sauron the Necromancer Myron were able to go at it. But from there we thought of what other topics like this we could try. One we are working on, for example, right now is Saruman versus the Witch King. But if you have other suggestions for us, then please leave us a comment below of why not try with whatever versus matchup you would like us to tackle. However, let's move on to today's. The first thing we need to do today is to get a solid understanding of what the One Ring can do to its wearer to help us later on. In the world of Arda, there are two commingling worlds, one of the unseen spirits, and the other of our day-to-day life, the world as we see it. Sauron's ring did not simply make its wearer invisible. When the ring slides on your finger, you go to the unseen world. I will also add here, the unseen world is neither good nor evil and contains both dark and bright spiritual beings, so it is definitely not just a place for evil things to go, basically somewhere that if there was some magic as such, they could also belong to it. For example, for a bit of a better understanding, if we look at Gandalf's conversation with Frodo after Frodo awoke in Rivendell from the attack on Weathertop. But it was a terribly narrow shave, so to speak. You were in gravest peril while you wore the ring, for then you were half in the Wraith world yourself, and they might have seized you. You could see them, and they could see you. Our scenario is an admittedly fictional one, though it is interesting to speculate. How, first, to get the One Ring to a Balrog? You may think, who was the most powerful one, because they might be the best for it. Well, you had Gothmog being the Lord of Balrogs, so in terms of hierarchy, it may have been most likely in a way to have been him. However, him dying during the First Age during the fall of Gondolin is obviously a pretty big stumbling block to that, so none of that ancient race of Flame and Shadow, and probably not Wings either, would work for this, so instead we must think a bit more clever about how this will work. When Gandalf explains the nature of the ring's power and its effects, before Frodo sets out on his journey from Bag End, he means what it will do to a mortal generally, Frodo specifically at this point, where Gandalf tells him, "A mortal, Frodo, who keeps one of the great rings, does not die, but he does not grow or obtain more life. He merely continues, until at last every minute is a weariness. And if he often uses the ring to make himself invisible, he fades. He becomes in the end invisible permanently, and walks into the twilight under the eye of the dark power that rules the rings. Yes, sooner or later if he is strong or well-meaning to begin with, but neither strength nor good purpose will last. Sooner or later the dark power will devour him." As a Maya of the same order of Sauron and Gandalf, the Balrogs are never described as idiots per se. However, we get a sense they're not exactly among the wise either. For one, if they are really capable of flight, and so many have died from falling, then surely they are just a little bit too stupid to really exist. But if you want to see the full video on that debate, you can find it on the channel too. Anyway, Gandalf in the late Third Age was as powerful as anyone living, save perhaps the Lord of the Rings himself, and yet we know what horror came to him when he considered what terror might be wielded through him taking the One Ring and the dark sorcery that came with it. The magic, again, is more of how Sauron exerts his will and purpose on others, able as he is to use the Orcs and Easterlings, Dunlendings and Haradrim alike as his fingers, who crawl out and do his bloody work, but it is effective and as black as a moonless night. What effect should a ring have on a Balrog then? We have rewritten the Bridge of Khazad-dûm to reflect a world where Tolkien decided that, halfway through Moria, Frodo should lose his ring only for it to be found by the Balrog later, who approaches invisible through corridors of massive stone plinths beneath high, vaulted ceilings, invisibly stalking his prey. Gandalf may be able to sense something, as Gandalf is able to read minds on more than one occasion and only appears to really refrain from doing so out of manners. He searches through the ancient halls of what once had been the greatest realm of the Dwarven king, the Dwarodalf of old, now Khazad-dûm and Moria, which, by the way, is a Sindarin word meaning the Black Pit. To begin our story, we must make up our events of how the ring even gets into Durin's Bane's heart. Frodo gets parted from the One Ring after they escape from the scuffle with the Orcs by Balin's tomb. Frodo is forced to take up arms and slay the Orcs as best he can, those who live in the Misty Mountains, the ones who later, in the actual story, go searching for the Fellowship to revenge their fallen comrade, which of course, see our video on Are There Any Good Orcs to see more on this. But anyway, Khazad-dûm was once a mighty city, one of the 3 great cities of the dwarves in fact, with the others being Belegost and Nogrod from earlier ages. However, with the Fellowship making a racket, killing the Orcs there and now walking its halls, the Balrog of Morgoth, who, having slept for millennia, wakes up and makes chase after our fellowship full of rage and confusion and pitiless anger, and yet the ground of adamant trembles beneath it. The fellowship approaches the bridge, but Durin's Bane is not far behind. As the chase is being made, a golden glint catches its eye. The Balrog may be dazed and confused after sleeping for so long, but this shiny object focuses its mind. He's drawn to it. He cannot look away from it. He has, for just a moment, forgotten all about those intruders. It feels right. He picks up the ring. This treasure is now his. The Balrog has found the One Ring, Sauron's ring, with Frodo having lost it in the panic of escaping. He slips it on as though it is one size fits all. Its fires swell, hotter and hotter they grow. The strength of this beast increases. It can see for miles and miles. The Balrog could smell his prey if they were 100 miles away. The silence of hobbit feet were now like drums in the deep, so you can only imagine how the breathing of a dwarf would sound to him too. He has swelled with just overwhelming new power. He can see every orc in existence bowing at his feet. Every man, every elf, every dwarf is now in chains. Every being who dared to stand up to him instantly turned to ash and blown away in the wind. He was reborn. He was powerful. He felt invincible. All of this took place in the mind of Durin's Bane within seconds, and suddenly he snapped back, ring on his fiery finger, remembering the intruders in his home. This creature would be mad, angry, yes, but insane with all this information. When Sam is tempted by the ring, he sees himself as Samwise the Strong, a leader of great importance and greatly beloved by the world. What does the ring have to tempt a Balrog with though? Most likely, more power. Balrogs have always followed, but now it was time for this one to lead. Meanwhile though, back with the 9 walkers for just a moment. Gandalf has halted, telling the Fellowship to make haste, but they will not leave their wizard friend's side. Aragorn stands to his right, Legolas and Gimli to his left. Frodo, Sam, Merry and Pippin are crouched behind Boromir as he makes ready his shield. Plumes of dust rise up as each step draws this monster of shadow and flame ever closer. One of the Maiar, like a Balrog, might react differently and not disappear, though we have chosen this idea and we're going to stick with it as though the ring would have similar effects on this creature as it would on humans. And if our glimpses into the mind of those who have worn the ring give insight enough to judge the matter, the ring seems too great a power to trifle with. And so, it was in that moment the foul spirit, wreathed in smoke and yet unseen, approached the company who had woken him up. They can feel him. They can sense him, but they cannot see him. The flames of a bygone age seek them out, although he is now able to settle his pulse, if there was a heart, that is. The Balrog approaches wrapped in the ring's invisible shield, doubly wrapped in the dark. But again, Gandalf is no old fool, and he gathers his companions around him. The Balrog has become so large that moving within the halls is cumbersome. As he approaches, he knocks out the long colonnade of gables which upholds the high ceilings in Khazad-dûm, and like dominoes, each massive megalithic stone comes down in seconds. Echo on echo, on and on. They collapse around the Fellowship, destroying the bridge of Khazad-dûm that stood behind them. Gandalf is shook at what he's seen. His mind is working faster than it has ever done before, but nothing comes to him. He draws Glamdring in one hand, his staff held tighter than ever in his other, and turning to the others, Gandalf says,
"You fools! This power was far beyond any of you, and somehow it has now become far beyond myself as well. If he kills me, we are all going to die. We must try to blind him so we can fly. Use your blades. Reflect the light into his eyes. Legolas, you know where to aim. We must send this servant of the secret fire back to the shadow."
And with that, a loud thud of a footstep was in front of them. The Balrog has come before the Fellowship, and the smoke rises around it like breath hanging in the winter air. The fires grow so hot that the Fellowship become disorientated. They cannot see the Balrog itself, but the heat and smoke coming from it still fills the chamber around them. There is no hope now. Gandalf attempts to set up a shield, but to no avail. The Balrog cannot be stopped. One crack of its whip and the shield is broken. And so is the wizard. Gandalf falls, a tear in his eye. Sadly, there is no better fight from the others. Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli and Boromir all charge the shadow head-on, arrows flying, axes swinging, and swords gleaming. But it was all in vain, as they were swiped aside like a common housefly. And the less said about the end of our hobbits, the better too. So here marks the end of our fellowship. But what next for Durin's Bane? Well, despite visions of grandeur, he would retreat to the darkness, to the most unknown depths of what lay beneath Khazad-dûm, in tunnels that went almost to the centre of Middle-earth. And here he lay and slept, simply content with knowing no power could match him anymore. The risk of losing his ring was not worth the risk of war to enslave all others. It was his ring to keep now. His precious. But you may be thinking, what about Sauron here? Stories, rumours, legends spread from Moria of this unrivaled power that swelled there. Sauron had all but figured out what had happened, but he could not risk taking on the power of a Balrog who had his ring. Sauron accepted that he must let Durin's Bane lie in sleep, as, with him being so far underground, out of the way, he was no real threat to Sauron's true goal, the complete ruling of Middle-earth. Sauron would keep an ever-watchful eye on the once great kingdom of the dwarves, but in the end, it was just not worth fighting such a foe, when, without the likes of Gandalf and Aragorn being around anymore, victory was all but certain for him in the rest of the war. He may have had to sacrifice his ring, but it meant victory was his. What if Shelob, the monstrous spider of Cirith Ungol, had gotten her claws, or rather her fangs, on the One Ring? This is a horrifying thought. After all, Shelob is already terrifying enough on her own, an ancient and near immortal creature of immense power. But if she had wielded Sauron's ultimate weapon, well, the outcome would be, let's say, catastrophic. So, let's dive in and explore the terrifying possibilities. There age-long she had dwelt, an evil thing in spider form, even such as once of old had lived in the land of the elves in the west that is now under the sea, such as Beren fought in the mountains of terror in Doriath, and so came to Luthien upon the green sward amid the hemlocks in the moonlight long ago. How Shelob came there, flying from ruin, no tales tell. For out of the dark years few tales have come. But still she was there, who was there before Sauron and before the first stone of Barad-dûr, and she served none but herself, drinking the blood of elves and men, bloated and grown fat with endless brooding on her feasts, weaving webs of shadow. For all living things were her food, and her vomit darkness. Far and wide her lesser broods, bastards of the miserable mates, her own offspring, that she slew, spread from glen to glen, from the Ethel Duath to the eastern hills, to Dol Guldur and the vastness of Mirkwood. But none could rival her, Shelob the Great, last child of Ungoliant to trouble the unhappy world. Before we dive into what could have happened if Shelob claimed the One Ring, let's take a moment to explore her background and her powers to kind of set the scene. Shelob isn't just any monster, she is a creature with a terrifying lineage. She is the last offspring of Ungoliant, an ancient being of darkness who once aided Morgoth in destroying the two trees of Valinor. Ungoliant herself consumed light, and her insatiable hunger could never be satisfied. Shelob, though lesser in power than her mother, inherited this dark hunger and power. By the time of the Lord of the Rings, Shelob had made her lair in the mountains of Cirith Ungol between Minas Morgul and Mordor. For centuries she devoured all who dared enter her domain. Her webs, capable of ensnaring even the mightiest, were not just physical traps. They symbolized her dominion over the pass, a crucial gateway to Mordor. Shelob's powers are numerous. Her venom is lethal, capable of paralyzing her prey in an instant. She is intelligent, cunning, and capable of instilling fear in even the bravest of hearts. In fact, Sauron himself feared her to some degree. He allowed her to remain near Mordor not out of alliance, but because she served a purpose in keeping intruders away. It is important to note that Shelob's desire was not for conquest like Sauron. Her motives were simple and more primal. She wanted to feed, and nothing could satisfy that hunger. But what if that hunger met the most dangerous artifact in Middle-earth? The One Ring. Let's have a look. Darkness lay thick in the tunnels of Cirith Ungol, a suffocating blackness that pressed upon Frodo as he stumbled forward, weary and burdened by the weight of the One Ring. Unbeknownst to him, Shelob, the ancient spawn of Ungoliant, crept closer, her many eyes gleaming with malice, her monstrous form slinking through her webs with silent purpose. Frodo faltered, the weight of his burden becoming too much. The ring, a heavy chain around his neck, slipped from his grasp as his body gave in to exhaustion. "Mr. Frodo!" cried Sam, but it rolled, glinting faintly in the dim light, catching Shelob's attention. She paused, her foul breath heavy in the air as her eyes fell upon it. This was no mere trinket. For a moment, the great spider hesitated, her ancient mind pondering the nature of this strange, small object. Her hunger had always been simple, for flesh, for blood, for the despair of those she ensnared. But now something else stirred in her dark heart, a different hunger, more profound, more terrible. This awoke within her. Her many legs descended upon the ring, wrapping around it as though it were prey. A sudden surge of power coursed through her, ancient and dark, an extension of the malice that already filled her being. The One Ring had found a new bearer, and Shelob, in her monstrous simplicity, was not immune to its allure. In that instant, the creature who had long guarded the pass between Minas Morgul and Mordor was transformed. Her mind, once driven by primal hunger, expanded with the ring's malevolent will. She saw visions of endless dominion, webs stretching across the vast expanse of Middle-earth, ensnaring all within her shadow. Frodo and Sam, now paralysed in Shelob's web, unable to put up any resistance, could only watch as the creature devoured them whole, with the ring disappearing into her gaping maw. The once halfling's light was swallowed into darkness, and Shelob, now a creature of unimaginable power, turned her gaze outwards. Driven by the ring's lust for dominance, Shelob emerged from her lair, no longer content with her dark tunnels. The land before her trembled, for Shelob, now consumed by the ring's insidious will, sought more than mere sustenance. She sought control. First, she set her sights on the lands that lay at her doorstep. Minas Morgul, the dark city of the Nazgul. Her web, once confined to the shadowed pass of Cirith Ungol, now spread like a blight across the fields of Gorgoroth, ensnaring everything in her path. Orcs, men, anything alike were caught in her webs, struggling and writhing to escape, but none could resist her. The Witch King himself, leader of the Nazgul, gathering his army to march on Gondor, rode forth to confront her. But even he, mighty in his own right, was unprepared for the force that Shelob had become. With a single lash of her poisoned stinger, she struck him down. His black robes collapsed into a heap, and his spirit was torn from its undead form. The Nazgul fell, one by one, before her, their shrieks echoing into the darkened skies. Shelob, now queen of this desolate land, turned her gaze toward Mordor itself. The Dark Lord Sauron, sensing the disturbance, prepared his defences. Yet, even he underestimated the power Shelob now wielded. The ring, which had once been the instrument of his dominion, now served another. At the gates of Barad-dûr, Shelob arrived, her colossal form casting a shadow even over Sauron's great fortress. The Dark Lord appeared at the pinnacle of his tower, the eye of Sauron blazing with fury. But Shelob, empowered by the ring, was no longer a creature to be feared from the shadows. She was fear itself. The ground shook beneath her as she advanced, her webs creeping over the jagged black stones of Barad-dûr. Sauron unleashed his forces. Orcs, trolls, every terrifying creature that still remained in his lands. But all was swept aside by Shelob's relentless onslaught. Her hunger had transformed, no longer satisfied with mere flesh. She craved power, dominion over all life, and the ring urged her ever onward. As the eye of Sauron burned bright, Shelob struck. Her venom, now imbued with the ring's dark essence, pierced through the black walls of Barad-dûr. The tower, long a symbol of Sauron's might, began to crumble. The Dark Lord, sensing his imminent defeat, sought to reclaim the ring through sheer force of will, but it was now too late. Shelob, driven by her insatiable desire, resisted his pull, and with a final, earth-shaking blow, she brought the great tower down. Barad-dûr fell into ruin, and with it, Sauron's reign over Mordor. Shelob, now the undisputed ruler of the Dark Lands, spun her webs across Middle-earth, weaving a domain of shadows and despair. The free peoples, those who remained, lived in constant fear, for Shelob was no mere beast. She was the embodiment of hunger, of corruption, and now the ultimate power. She had become what her mother had teased. Under her reign, Middle-earth became a land of endless night, her web stretching from the far reaches of the north to the plains of Gondor. There was no escape, no light, only the suffocating darkness of her endless dominion. So I hope you liked that what-if scenario, but of course there are other more speculative outcomes that we could also consider. For instance, Shelob, though powerful, might not have fully understood the ring's significance, or may not have even cared. She could have devoured Frodo without realizing the power she had gained. In that scenario, she might not immediately be driven to conquer Middle-earth. Instead, the ring could amplify her natural instincts, allowing her to remain in her lair, but making her far more dangerous to anyone who approached. Think of it more like Gollum, who stayed in the Misty Mountains. She wouldn't bother to venture outside, but anyone who came in was almost certain to never leave. Her webs might even gain unnatural properties, ensnaring victims not just physically, but mentally. Anyone caught would be under her dominion, unable to escape her power. There's also the possibility that Shelob, though resistant to domination, might even fall under the influence of Sauron himself. While her primal instincts would make her resistant to the ring's typical forms of corruption, the Dark Lord might still be able to exert some control over her, using her as an immensely powerful weapon in his war against the Free Peoples, playing up to her insatiable hunger, saying that he could satisfy that. Sauron was still a master manipulator, and it's not black and white to say that she would be able to overpower him. However, in this case, the alliance between Sauron and Shelob would be fragile at best. Again, it harkens back to the story of Morgoth and Ungoliant. They were never true allies, and it didn't take a lot for them to go at each other. Shelob's hunger would always be a threat to Sauron's own power, and the two would likely turn on each other at some point, just like her mother and his master once did. And so there we have it. What would happen if Shelob had claimed the One Ring? The outcome would have been terrifying no matter how it played out. Whether Shelob waged a campaign of devastation across Middle-earth, engaged in a deadly power struggle with Sauron, or simply became a more potent and deadly force of evil within her lair, the world would have been plunged into a new age of darkness. The One Ring amplifies the worst traits in its wearer, And with Shelob, that trait is an insatiable hunger for power, control, and destruction. Middle-earth as we know it would have become her hunting ground, a place of webs, poison, and death.